Hello and welcome. I'm Tom Burges Watson. You are watching W News, broadcasting live from the Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. Kamala Harris rallies in Houston as both candidates competing for the White House take their campaigns to Texas. Donald Trump travels to Austin in a bid to resonate with younger male voters as polls show the race is on a knife edge. And Antony Blinken holds talks with the Lebanese Prime Minister as Washington urges Israel to limit its military campaign against Hezbollah. Welcome. We begin with the latest on the US election. And Donald Trump is visiting Texas today to record an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, the most popular podcast in the country. Well, the appearance reflects a strategic move by the Trump campaign, aiming to connect with younger male audiences through podcasts instead of traditional media. Well, his Democratic opponent, Kamala Harris, is also in Texas, taking her campaign to Houston, where she's expected to be endorsed by a lineup of musical stars. Well, it is the race to the finish line for the US presidential candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, who are squeezing in as many swing rally states as they can ahead of the 5th of November. Well, the former president has been honing his criticism of his opponent's border policy, while Vice President Kamala Harris has lined up politicians, actors and musicians to elevate her message. Our correspondent Caroline Malone has more.
Legendary US rocker Bruce Springsteen pumped up the crowds in swing state Georgia on Thursday night. Known as a great songwriter, he used lyrics and a speech to make a clear case for Kamala Harris.
I want a president who reveres the Constitution, who does not threaten but wants to protect and guide our great democracy, who believes in the rule of law and the peaceful transfer of power.
Harris is not short on star-studded support. Former President Barack Obama by her side, warning people off her political opponent.
What I cannot understand is why anybody would think that Donald Trump will shake things up in a way that is good for you.
Just 12 days left in one of the most consequential elections of our lifetime.
The consequences are potentially huge, and Trump knows it too. From Las Vegas, Nevada, he is hyping up his plans for no tax on tips, a popular message among the people here who work in the service industry. And he's also insisting he'll increase tariffs if he gets re-elected.
We will make America safe again. And we will make America great again. God bless you, Nevada. God bless you.
Trump attracted big crowds. He's due later on Joe Rogan's popular podcast to try and engage more young male voters. Harris had her biggest rally yet, with 20,000 people turning up in Georgia, which may only be surpassed by plans for a mega Texas rally on Friday evening, in which Beyoncé is tipped to perform. Harris is gaining support among white women and Trump among Hispanic men. But overall, it's a dead heat in the popular vote, according to a final poll by the New York Times and Siena College. There is still everything to play for. Caroline Malone, Arabiya News, Washington.
Well, for more, we can cross to Austin, Texas, and speak to our correspondent, Toni, who's standing by for us. Toni, great to have you with us. Just let's start by talking about Donald Trump there in Texas. What's he doing there?
Well, Tom, by no stretch of the imagination is Texas a swing state. So the fact that we have two presidential candidates stopping here on Friday, just 11 days before the election, really tells us something. And for Donald Trump, that something is young male voters. This is a growing and targeted demographic of his campaign. And he's going to be doing this interview with Joe Rogan, who hosts one of the most popular podcasts in the United States. He has more than 52 million subscribers, many of them young right-leaning men, and this is the audience that Trump is targeting. They tend to be low-propensity voters, so he's really trying to get this message out for them to go and vote. And in fact, there was a Reuters Ipsos poll that came out earlier today showing that Trump now trails Harris by just 2 percentage points when it comes to Hispanic men, 44 to 46%. Back in 2020, Trump had a 19-point deficit compared to Joe Biden among the same demographics. So he is gaining a lot of ground when it comes to Hispanic voters, when it comes to black voters, young male voters overall. And part of the reason is his messaging. He's been talking a lot about the economy, about inflation, and also immigration. This is a winning issue for the Republicans. It is really seen as Kamala Harris's biggest political vulnerability, and Texas is on the front lines of the immigration debate. We are a border state. We have the longest border with Mexico, and this was really ground zero when we had those record migration crossings in the past year. So this is a place where he can get his message across, not to just Hispanic and black voters in Texas, but really a broader message out to the rest of the United States.
Okay, so that's Donald Trump in Texas and what he's doing there. What's Kamala Harris doing there?
Yeah, I mean, as much as this is not a swing state, this is a solidly Republican state. So Kamala Harris being here is about also sending a message. And her message to voters is really to paint Texas as the extreme example when it comes to abortion access in America. Texas has some of the strictest abortion bans in the country. There are no exceptions for rape or incest. The only exception is to save the life of a mother. But the criteria around that is very ill-defined. And we have seen women being turned away at emergency rooms, at hospitals, from doctors' offices when they are miscarrying because doctors are so scared to perform an abortion on them. And the reason is because doctors, if they are convicted of performing an illegal abortion, they face up to 99 years in prison, which has really had a chilling effect across the state. We used to have 4,400 abortions take place on average every single month. That is now down to 7. And the message that Kamala Harris is trying to send out to voters is that if Trump is reelected, there will be 50 Texases in the United States when it comes to access to abortion care. She's also here stumping for Democratic Congressman Colin Allred, who is in this very tight race to unseat the Republican Senator Ted Cruz. And this is really seen as the only state right now where Democrats even have the slightest chance of flipping a Senate seat, which would be pivotal for the Democrats. And certainly if Kamala Harris is elected, she's going to need the full support of the Senate. So she's also here for that reason. And as you mentioned, Beyonce is meant to be showing up. She's going to be performing. There's been a lot of rumors swirling that she was going to be part of this campaign. But for those diehard country old school fans, Willie Nelson is also going to be on hand tonight.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of stars out there on the stage. You mentioned a couple of the most important issues on voters' minds there: immigration, abortion. There's another issue as well, of course, the economy. I mean, in what order would you put those issues as far as voters are concerned? What's the most important things on voters' minds right now?
Well, what we have seen consistency in the polling is that the economy is the top issue for voters this election cycle. It has to do with inflation. We saw very high inflation rates after the pandemic. Housing has become unaffordable for a lot of people, particularly for young people who are starting off in life and want to buy their first home. So that is by far across the country the most pressing issue. This is an issue that people feel and experience on a daily basis when they are at the grocery store, when they are at retail stores, when they are filling up their cars with petrol. So this is the top issue. Immigration, though, is also very much a top issue. And I have to say that part of the reason is because it is no longer a border state issue. So it's always been something that voters have considered in those places that are directly up against Mexico. But something that the governor here in Texas has done over the last 2 years is that he has been busing migrants from the Texas border up into what are considered to be sanctuary cities, often very liberal Democratic cities up in the west of the country, in the northeast of the country, places where you don't have tens of thousands of people crossing into the state without any resources on a daily basis. And this has really opened up the issue, I think, to a lot of voters in these more northern states that really hadn't considered it in the same way, because now their infrastructure is being stressed. Their healthcare systems are being stressed. Their school systems are being stressed because of the influx of these migrants. And then I would think after that we would get abortion. Of course, you have a very strong anti-abortion group here in the United States. They will always be anti-abortion. But for a lot of women, this is a crucial issue, even for moderate Republican women. Women need to have access to this type of reproductive care. And of course, the larger concern for some of these women is that whatever happens on the abortion front could just be the tip of the iceberg, that we could really start seeing IVF and contraception next in line.
Okay, and just lastly, Toni, I mean, looking at what happened last time, there was a transition of power in the United States. There was violence, wasn't there? And there must be concerns of that risk of violence once again overshadowing the democratic process. Toni?
Yeah, there absolutely is this concern. The FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, issued a bulletin quite recently warning of the potential for political violence from extremists who have these election-related grievances. This is a very divided, split country right now. So no matter who wins on November 5th, you're going to have half of the population very unhappy with that decision. And speaking to experts, they have been telling me that political violence in the United States right now is at its highest sustained level since the 1970s. The big difference being that in the 1970s, when you had mostly left-leaning extremists, they were targeting institutions and buildings. And what we have been seeing in January 6th and other instances, we're seeing more right-leaning extremists targeting people, fellow Americans.
This nondescript building in Phoenix, Arizona, is where election ballots are counted. It's normally quiet.
Count the legal votes.
But in the days following the 2020 elections, it became a hotbed of contention. False claims of election fraud spurred violent threats and armed protests, the workers inside fearing for their safety. When the counting starts this year, election workers will be behind bulletproof glass, 2 layers of fencing, and even more security cameras.
This is to keep the people working in this building safe, to keep the ballot safe, but also to give a clear direction for individuals who want to come out and express their First Amendment right, where they can go, where the limits are.
U.S. officials say threats and acts of violence against public servants are at unprecedented levels. Data shows that threats against members of Congress have jumped 700% since 2016. Federal judges, 160%. While nearly 40% of local election officials say they've experienced threats, harassments, or abuse for doing their jobs.
Every day we receive threats from people calling saying, I know you're going to steal the election, or people calling or sending emails or voicemails, or in some cases even showing up on our homes to threaten us or to scare us.
According to U.S. law enforcement officials, soft targets for political violence could include campaign events, ballot drop box locations, and political rallies. Some voting centers have even installed panic buttons, giving workers a direct line to the police.
Experts say the internet has allowed misinformation and conspiracy theories around election fraud to spread rapidly. But despite the high-pitched rhetoric, some research shows that extremist group mobilization has nearly halved since 2020.
There's a variety of explanations. The leading one is probably the law enforcement crackdown following the Capitol riots in 2021. Many of these groups were either decapitated or had their leadership substantially imprisoned. And the groups may continue to fear law enforcement crackdown thereafter.
Even if Election Day goes off without a hitch, some worry that any delays or questions over the results could trigger violence. And with places like Arizona already warning it could take up to 13 days to count the votes, election officials are preparing for the worst. Toni Waterman, Al Arabiya News, Austin.
Well, let's stay with the US election and get some more analysis now with the Pulitzer Prize-winning author and professor of law at the Rochester Institute of Technology, David K. Johnston. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Interesting, isn't it? We got both candidates in Texas today. I mean, let's be clear, there's no illusion here that Texas remains a safely red state, doesn't it?
I don't know if it's safely red at this point. It's possible that Colin Allred, the Democratic candidate for the U.S. Senate, will defeat Ted Cruz, who's personally very unpopular and has done some things that upset Texas residents. For example, going on vacation to Mexico when there was a freeze, an extraordinary event in Texas in which a number of people died. But not most likely it will remain a red state.
Okay, I mean, the gap has been narrowing, though, hasn't it, in Texas over the last couple of decades? I mean, do you think it's fair to call it a purple state, then?
I don't think we really know. One of the problems in America is that I'm not sure the polls are reliable. Many of the polls are finding that fewer than 1 in 100 people who answer the telephone will answer the questions. And I think that suggests a self-selection bias that may not give us reliable polling information, even though many of the polls seem reasonably consistent.
Yeah, they are pretty tight, aren't they? And if nothing else, what we can draw from the polls, when you look at the latest New York Times poll, for example, 48 and 48. I mean, there's really nothing in it. That's today's poll. One thing that's looking increasingly likely as a scenario, isn't it, is that on the 5th of November, we probably won't get an answer, will we?
Probably not on the Electoral College. Kamala Harris will win the popular vote, and I predict she'll win it by more than 10 million votes, just as Biden won by 7 million and Hillary Clinton by more than 3 million. But Americans do not elect their president by popular vote. They elect them by states through something called the Electoral College. So really are only 7 states that matter in this presidential election, and we don't know how that's going to turn out.
Okay, and if that latest poll is accurate, 48-48, it tells us something we've been talking about for a long time, covering US elections. The United States is a deeply divided country. Does it look more deeply divided now than it did, say, last time the country went to the polls?
Yes, and I frankly find all of this quite surprising as someone who's been through many elections as a journalist, because we have one candidate who is a convicted felon who has announced he will be dictator on day one, but then he'll give it up, who has called for suspending the Constitution and for arresting his opponents. Anything in any previous election before Donald Trump, that would have disqualified you, and yet he has tens of millions of supporters, very ardent supporters.
Yeah, I was going to say, unprecedented in so many ways, especially when you look at the language that's being bandied around. We've had Kamala Harris calling her running mate, her rival on the campaign, a fascist yesterday. He's calling her stupid and lazy. I mean, this is really atypical, isn't it?
This is like junior high school. Back in 1988, I wrote that Donald Trump might become president of the United States. And I followed him all the years since then, when I was at the Philadelphia Inquirer, when I was at the New York Times, and since. And he is behaving as I predicted that he would. I think what's fascinating is the reaction of so many Americans. And Mitt Romney, who was the Republican presidential candidate 16 years ago, has said he believes Trump's success is because millions of members of his party, the Republican Party, do not believe in democracy and do not believe in the Constitution. And indeed, there are a lot of people saying what America needs is a dictator.
Okay, well, on a slightly brighter note, and turning our eye back to Texas, there's quite a lot of stars being wheeled out to cheer on the candidates. Beyonce on Team Harris, and Beyonce will be taking the stage. Do you think, these stars like Taylor Swift and some of the others that have come out in favor of Kamala Harris, and there have been stars that have come out in favor of Donald Trump as well, Hulk Hogan, Elon Musk, to name just 2. Do you think they make much of a difference?
Not really. The difference between the 2 candidates is that Kamala Harris's supporters, like Taylor Swift, are themselves incredibly popular, and Taylor Swift has been responsible for more than 400,000 young people going and registering to vote. The people supporting Donald Trump from the entertainment world are rather minor characters in comparison, but I don't think that has much of an effect, and it's certainly not about the policy issues that should be the center of a presidential election.
Okay, so possibly a bit of mobilization, but not much more than that, you're saying, Professor.
Enthusiasm and getting people to turn out. That's the point of having movie and TV and singing stars support you.
Okay, maybe getting people to the rallies as well. Maybe Beyonce's a little bit of an extra crowd drawer there in Texas as well. Another type of endorsement comes from the newspapers. The New York Post firmly on Team Trump. In the headlines as well, the LA Times and the Washington Post. And they're in the headlines because neither is committing to either candidate. Why don't you think that they're doing that?
I think it's pretty clear that the physician who owns the Los Angeles Times now, where I also work, simply doesn't want to get into this. He has some very strong views. The paper did a huge self-expose of its history of racist and discriminatory policies, but he's been much more tepid on the editorial page. And at the Washington Post, I think it's the same thing with Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon. But let's keep in mind that the editorial page belongs to the publisher, and he or she can do whatever they please on the editorial page. Neither of these publishers or owners has interfered in any way in the news coverage. And in fact, they have poured money into and been very supportive of news coverage in all sorts of areas, including the election.
So do you think it will make much of a difference, the fact that these two much read publications are not, as they have done in previous years, committing to either candidate?
Yeah, you know, I've never in my 58-year career met somebody who said I changed my decision on who to vote for any election from city councilman to president because of a newspaper editorial. It may make the publisher feel good or the staff feel good if they like the publisher's choice, but I don't see them as having impact. What matters is turning out, knocking on doors, driving people, if necessary, to the polls, or making sure they fill out their mail-in ballot. It's voting at the end of the day that matters.
Okay, 12 days to go, just under, in fact. Where are you seeing the race heading? Do you think that the razor-thin element to the polling is going to remain a consistent theme for the next 11 days, or do you see the gap widening, and if so, why?
Well, that's where I don't trust the polls. When you have a response rate of less than 1 in 100, and in some polls less than 1 in 200, I'm not sure you're getting reliable results, even if you can check the boxes that you have the right number of people in each demographic for your poll. We've seen an enormous amount of early voting turnout. A lot of it's been by Republicans. And what we don't know is, are these Republicans who are going to vote for Kamala Harris because they can't stand Donald Trump, or are they going to vote for Donald Trump because they can't imagine having a woman in the White House?
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm being told we're out of time, but really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Professor David K. Johnston, thank you very much indeed. Let's get a check of some other news stories we're following for you now. The U.S. Justice Department has reached a $100 million settlement with the Singaporean operator of a cargo ship which destroyed a Baltimore bridge. Well, the settlement does not include any damages for the eventual reopening of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. Well, the families of 6 road workers who lost their lives are pursuing legal claims of their own. A Los Angeles County District Attorney has recommended that Eric and Lyle Menendez be resentenced over the murders of their parents. This is due to new evidence that's come to light. Well, the 1989 murders of Kitty and Jose Menendez in Beverly Hills have captivated the U.S. and inspired a popular Netflix series. Well, for their release, a judge must approve the recommendation, followed by a parole board decision. The EU chief, Ursula von der Leyen, pledges €20 million in immediate aid for Bosnia, following on from deadly and devastating floods there. Earlier on this month, 27 people died in floods and landslides, which washed away infrastructure, cutting off many populated areas in central and southern Bosnia. And environmental campaigners in London have lost the legal challenge against the British government. They'd accused the government of failing to meet obligations to protect citizens from the effects of climate change. Well, a judge at the High Court in London ruled that the government's climate adaptation policy, drawn up by the previous Conservative government, was lawful. Well, the decision is expected to be appealed. And voters go to the polls in Georgia tomorrow as the ruling party Georgian Dream seeks a fourth term in office. Opinion polls show the party remains the country's most popular choice, though it has lost ground since 2020 when it won almost 50% of the vote and a narrow parliamentary majority. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has been holding talks in London with Lebanon's caretaker Prime Minister, as well as with the foreign ministers of the United Arab Emirates and Jordan. Well, Blinken is continuing to push for diplomatic solutions in the region. Well, the United States has expressed hopes for fresh Gaza ceasefire negotiations coming during the next few days. Well, Arabiya's Olly Barratt filed this report for us from London.
Well, Antony Blinken headed into talks with Lebanon's Prime Minister here in London off the back of a Middle East tour on which he had not been calling for an immediate ceasefire with regards to Israel's military campaign inside Lebanon, but he had been saying that the US did not want to see a protracted military operation inside Lebanon. As I say, he started his day here in London with that meeting with Lebanon's Prime Minister, at which Antony Blinken said that he thought there was a real urgency to find a diplomatic solution. The Secretary of State also calling for more to be done to protect civilians inside Lebanon as Israel carries out those strikes, those ongoing strikes against Hezbollah. Now, while meeting with Jordan's foreign minister, some strong words in that meeting here in London. Ayman Safadi describing the situation in Gaza thus: "We do see ethnic cleansing taking place," he said, "and that has got to stop." Now, that is a characterization that Israel would strongly deny. Jordan's foreign minister also described what he believes is the region on the brink, he says, of a regional war. Now, Antony Blinken, from his side, praised Jordan for what he described as its remarkable leadership role when it comes to the humanitarian response in the region. And heading into these discussions here in London today, the State Department had made it clear that meeting with the foreign ministers of Jordan and the UAE was partly because the US sees them as key partners when it comes to discussing the post-conflict situation for Gaza. Now, Antony Blinken came here to London, as I say, at the end of his first trip to the Middle East since the killing of Hamas chief Yahya Sinwar, which, while in the Middle East, Antony Blinken described as an important opportunity to try and move towards the end of the war in Gaza. Olly Barratt in London for Al Arabiya News.
To Russia now, and the 16th BRICS summit in the Russian city of Kazan has now wrapped up. Moscow says 36 countries and 6 international organizations were represented at the event, which was hosted by President Vladimir Putin. But the summit fell short of accepting some new members. That's despite dozens of applications, as our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow now explains.
Over the 3 days of talks in Russia, leaders of the BRICS countries have discussed the group's vision for its own future. The first meeting of the group after it doubled in size set a membership process inviting some 13 countries to become partner states first. Moscow noted eventual decision on the new members will require a consensus among BRICS states. The discussions also centered on the reform of global governance, the United Nations and Bretton Woods institutions. All that is supposed to serve the needs of the developing economies, with BRICS agreeing the next wave of economic growth will come from the global south. On the sidelines in the Russian city of Kazan, several bilateral meetings were held, including the first in 5 years face-to-face between China's President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Russian President Vladimir Putin met with almost all the leaders in Kazan to talk bilateral ties and international issues. The world leaders called for de-escalation in the Middle East and urged peaceful solution to the conflict in Ukraine. Dasha Chernyshova, Al Arabiya, Kazan.
Let's going to check out some business news stories we're following for you now. German business morale improved more than expected in the month of October. The German Institute for Economic Research said its business climate index edged up more than 1 point in October to 86.5, up from the previous month. While the recovery in business sentiment ends a 4-month streak of decline for what is Europe's largest economy. Russia's central bank has hiked interest rates to 21%. This takes the borrowing cost to its highest level in more than 20 years. Well, the central bank said the hike was needed to fight inflation, which stands at 8.4%, and it's been driven up by massive increases in state spending related to Moscow's Ukraine offensive. Beijing says it's going to offer the Taliban tariff-free access to certain sectors of its economy. China has been seeking to develop ties with the Taliban ever since they took control of Afghanistan in 2021. Well, Kabul has asked China to allow it to be part of the $62 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor, which connects the resource-rich Chinese region of Xinjiang to Pakistan's Arabian seaport of Gwadar. Here are a couple of sports news stories for you. A source close to the case has told the AFP news agency that Paris Saint-Germain will refuse to comply with an order to pay the league, for the league to pay Kylian Mbappe $59.5 million in back pay. Well, a French league appeals committee has attempted to mediate between Mbappe and the club, which he left this year. Well, Mbappe said the multi-million-dollar figure is made up of the final 3 months of his salary plus bonuses. And Real Madrid's Carlo Ancelotti says Barcelona's revival is not keeping him up at night. This ahead of Saturday's Clásico. Well, Real Madrid are unbeaten in 42 La Liga matches and can match Barcelona's all-time record of 43 if they avoid defeat. Well, Madrid saw off Barcelona in both of last year's La Liga Clásicos. Before we leave you, a reminder of our top stories. Kamala Harris rallies in Houston as both candidates competing for the White House take their campaigns to the U.S. state of Texas. Donald Trump travels to Austin in a bid to resonate with younger male voters as polls show the race is on a knife edge. And Antony Blinken holds talks with the Lebanese Prime Minister as Washington urges Israel to limit its military campaign against Hezbollah. Well, that is all we have time for. Coming up next is Riz Khan, and then at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, do join Rosanna Lockwood for Global News Today, a wrap-up of top international news stories with exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers. That's it from us. Thanks for watching.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Welcome to the show. I'm Riz Khan. The annual cost of cybercrime is expected to reach $10 trillion next year. To put that figure into context, in terms of GDP, it would be the third biggest economy in the world after the US and China. That's why countries from Australia to China, the UK and US are racing to tighten up their cybersecurity laws. And it's why the UN is expected to pass a landmark cyber treaty in the coming weeks. From deepfakes and disinformation to hacks and attacks on infrastructure, healthcare and security networks, cybercrime is becoming the #1 challenge for law enforcement and intelligence agencies. And artificial intelligence is already changing the rules of the game. Now, our increasingly connected digital world makes us all more vulnerable to criminal gangs and state-sponsored hackers who can access our data and devices. Imagine them taking control of your bank account, your electrical vehicle, and even your pacemaker. Well, many of the world's leading experts on cybercrime recently met in the Saudi capital, Riyadh, at the Global Cybersecurity Forum. They included senior figures from Interpol, GCHQ, and even a cyber psychologist and profiler who inspired the popular TV crime drama CSI Cyber. We'll get an in-depth look at the issues, starting with my first guest, Chris Inglis, who was appointed by President Joe Biden to lead cyber operations in the US. Chris, thank you for making the time. Much appreciated. Now, if cybercrime could be likened to the Wild West, it sounds like President Biden called you in to be the sheriff.
Yes, that's an apt metaphor in terms of that time, but I'd like to call it the coach, because like in the sport world, coaches are responsible for the game plan, the strategy, the assignment of that strategy to various role players, but they don't actually step onto the field and try to kick the ball, right? So they actually are responsible for the fabric within which the players operate. And so that really was the role, because cyber is wider than it is tall. That's a bit of a cipher, but it's really about how do you take all the pieces that already exist and apply them in a way that becomes coherent and effective.
That width makes it sound much harder to manage, because if it's a narrow, tall silo.
Oh, it is. If you're in charge of something and you can direct, because you're the smartest person in the room, and I've never been that person, if you can direct, then it's pretty straightforward. People simply obey your commands. But no one in the room is as smart as everyone in the room when the room is full of cyberspace, right? And so you just have to figure out, how do you actually then create a fabric within which all the pieces make sense? And it's made even more interesting because this is a collaboration that must exist between the private sector and the public sector. And in the United States, and I'm sure in many other places as well, the private sector doesn't work for the government works for the private sector. And so you can't subordinate one to the other. They have to actually be in a collaboration.
So I was thinking that perhaps the highest profile threat in a generation was those recent assassination attempts on President Donald Trump. Does cybersecurity have a role to play in that kind of situation, or is that just someone who's like an amateurish, low-tech lone wolf? And if that's the case, does it put them beyond detection from those kind of cybersecurity threats?
Well, I think it depends upon what your definition of a cyber threat is, and I think I would be expansive in that definition. We care about cyber threats because they might hold data or computers at risk. But we also care about it because the abstraction of data and computers delivers critical functions, like energy supplies, or for that matter, the ability to conduct an election. And so that critical function is an abstraction of the piece parts that are at the foundations. But cyberspace also delivers confidence. In a free and open society, depending upon a free and open architecture, the internet, we depend upon that to reliably meet our expectations. When I flip the light switch, I want it to go on. And if that confidence can be held at risk because of disinformation, or because of flows of information that are restricted or modified, then cyber's in play in terms of how people think about the threats in their world and react accordingly.
It's interesting you say it that way, because we've learned about death threats and assassination plots being levied by Iran against former President Trump, and Russian groups targeting US influencers in order to sway voter opinion on elections and election campaigns. How serious is the threat facing the US, and what do you see the role of cybersecurity being in countering them?
Well, let's use the Russian example. And I'm no longer a sitting government official, so I say this as a private citizen, but with the experience that I can bring to bear, I would say that my bet is that the Russians were not attempting to simply steal data, or to, for that matter, even hold the election at risk in 2016, 18, 20, this goes on every 2 years, but rather to hold the confidence of the United States at risk. I think that was the aim. And in that regard, it's a serious threat. If all you cared about is whether all the votes have been properly tallied, I don't think we have a significant threat. We actually know how to defend the digital infrastructure and the processes on top of that. But defending confidence, that's a matter that's altogether different and harder. And so what we have to do is to provide a solid foundation where there should be no question that the digital infrastructure is doing what it does. And at that point, then leadership takes over, hopefully enlightened, transcendent, leadership, which actually would make the case for democracy in this day going forward, that our best days are ahead of us.
It's so interesting because the way you're describing it, We're talking, in effect, about cyber psychology. The cybersecurity is essentially a psychological threat as well.
Well, it is, because what are the nouns of cyberspace? They're not just technology. The choices that people make predict what the cyber futures are going to be. And the assignment of roles, responsibilities, or not, also defines our cyber future. So we got to get all of those right. The human being is at least in two of those three pillars I just identified. Psychology is necessarily in play.
Really interesting. Now, many conflicts around the world follow strategies that have been used in previous engagements. But the world was taken aback by the Israeli operation to detonate pagers and beepers, and walkie-talkies were used by members of Hezbollah. What was your reaction to that? And was it a game changer in the way people have to think about cybersecurity?
I don't think it was a game changer in terms of the art of the possible. It might be a game changer in terms of whether someone's willing to use that. Look, cyber has kind of broadly three purposes. One is it helps us synchronize assets that are not in cyberspace, they're in the physical world. Again, I've talked about the flow of electricity, the conduct of an election. Those are physical kind of activities that have some tangible form, but we use digital infrastructure to synchronize those, to coordinate those. Cyber can actually have an effect inside cyberspace. I create a bank account, sustain a bank account, or might steal that bank account almost entirely in cyberspace. I would never do that, to be clear. But that all happens in cyberspace in the form of zeros and ones, bits. But cyber also has an effect on confidence, as we've talked about earlier. Back to my first point, cyber can coordinate physical assets in the real world. And if those assets are the walkie-talkies or the pagers that are carried in the pockets of Hezbollah, then cyber has always been capable of doing that. The question is whether we employ it for that purpose. And so we shouldn't be surprised about what the art of the possible looks like when somebody finally effects it.
So this is that kind of threshold between, as you say, the ones and zeros and the real world impact.
Right. I think there's an oft-told phrase in the United States, which is we sometimes suffer a failure of imagination, not realizing what the full kind of power of the technology or the systems, the connection of those technology, what that might be. And I think in cyberspace that is, it's been ever thus. We need to think our way through what's the full power of this technology that we created, and is it still subordinate to our interest? Is it still something that serves our purposes as we would effect them? And are the values associated with how we use those something that we can not simply be proud of, but actually endure over time in creating the civil order that we prefer?
So is that kind of preemptive strike we saw against Hezbollah something the US could consider doing in a similar way? And how far can you go down the road from being, say, cyber defensive to cyber offensive?
Look, the United States, along with a number of other nations, has signed what's called the UN Global Group of Experts, CODA. I think it was about 2015. That described a set of things that responsible nations should do in their use of cyberspace. And one of those was that we would not hold critical infrastructure at risk or civilian populations at risk. Far be it from me to judge or to assess whether what the Israelis did against Hezbollah was kind of within the lanes of an ongoing war, and therefore under the laws of war might be deemed to be necessary and appropriate, proportional to that need. But I think that's the standard, that's the legal standard that we have to apply. What do we do to make sure that we are defending our populations, our civilian kind of activities in times of peace? And what do we do to exercise force, physical force, only in the realm of what's needed and what's proportionate to that need? Again, I'm not sitting in judgment of what the Israelis did, but that's the lens through which the United States would look at such a thing.
Well, I wonder, sir, then, is the concept of cybersecurity blurring the lines when it comes to setting rules and codes?
I don't think it blurs the lines, but it increases the possibilities, right? So cyber is an instrument of power. It's not the only instrument of power, and it's used in concert with other instruments of power. As you've already described, it can be used to control the instruments of war. It can be used to control the instruments of information dissemination or disinformation. It can be used to deliver critical functions. Cyber is integral to all of those things. It is a means, not necessarily the end to those purposes, and we need to think of it as such. Too often cyber is siloed as kind of the discipline that's kind of effected by IT specialists or cyber specialists, when in fact we're all implicated in cyber.
I wonder, when the US and Israel gave advance warning of a massive missile attack by Iran, is that the result of back-channel diplomacy, or does cybersecurity have a role to play in that?
I can't say. I wasn't involved in that particular action, certainly not in the government at the moment. But I would say, to the extent that one of the things that cyberspace can yield is information about the expectations, the aspirations of others, it is possible, plausible in my view, that cyber played a role in understanding what the expectations and intentions of Iran might be, and therefore gave not simply a source of that information, but a means to disseminate that information. Again, that's all hugely speculative on my part.
Looking at another conflict, what role has cybersecurity played in the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Oh, that's a really good question. So the Russians, who have, against all rules of law, tried to impose their will physically on the Ukrainians, have also tried to do so virtually, in and through cyberspace. And against all odds, the Ukrainians have more than been able to defend themselves. The Ukrainians are numerically inferior to the Russians, and they perhaps don't have the depth of a bench in terms of access to technology that the Russians might. And yet the Ukrainians have succeeded in that regard. And how is that the case? The Ukrainians have invested enough in their technology so that it's defensible. It's not perfect. No one has the perfect technology infrastructure. They've invested a lot in their expertise so that they're world-class in their ability to defend that architecture. And finally, they've developed and deployed a coalition, such the Russians have to beat a range of organizations. They have to beat the Ukrainians, they have to beat private sector institutions, all of whom are assisting in the defense. They're not co-combatants. They're simply providing meaningful support to the defense. And I think that's actually a lesson for all of us, whether we're individuals, whether we're organizations. It's the strength of our coalition that's going to make the biggest difference, and the fact that we either do or do not know our disposition in cyberspace. If we get those two things right, then the technology is the lesser of our challenges.
Now, you've emphasized the importance of collaboration and cooperation, both at a domestic and global level.
Yes.
When it comes to this issue. Now, do you fear the possibility of a more isolationist US foreign policy under, say, a second Donald Trump presidency could harm such cooperation with global partners and therefore kind of effectively weaken the US's defense?
Well, I'll leave it to the next president to decide what sort of engagement the US should have with the rest of the world. But I do think that a reduction in the degree of collaboration the United States has with other countries is not simply to the collective detriment, but it's to the United States' detriment. There are perspectives and capabilities and, frankly, innovation that the United States alone cannot generate on its own behalf. And I think to the extent that any group of organizations or people in excess of one typically performs at a better level geometrically than single efforts.
We're seeing kind of technology spread just beyond domestic and international to space. So I wonder what role cybersecurity plays when it comes to space wars.
Well, that's a good question. That's highly speculative on my part, not being a space expert in any way, shape, or form. But I think that space is a natural extension, right, of our life on Earth. And there are strategic assets in space that allow us to live the lives we prefer on Earth. And if they were held at risk, we'd be much the poorer for it. Global positioning system, the GPS comes immediately to mind. There probably isn't a person in this room that hasn't used some geolocation service to try to figure out how to get from point A to point B quickly. But package delivery services use that. The U.S. Postal Service uses that. We use that to synchronize things in time, not just space. That's one of many assets that are dependent upon space. And so if we held space at risk successfully, we would find egregious consequences here on Earth.
It's interesting when we look at the private sector and governments. Now, I wonder, in your opinion, to what degree can cybersecurity be trusted to the private sector, such as powerful players like Elon Musk, controlling, for example, a network of satellites?
Let's leave Elon Musk aside for the moment. That perhaps kind of conjures up all manner of things that are maybe kind of interesting, but not on my part well informed. But I would say that we have no choice but to cede a large part of this responsibility to the private sector. That's where innovation takes place. That's where capacity development takes place, deployment takes place. Defense, they're the first line of defense. So the private sector is, for want of any other viable solution, and I can think of none, they're really engaged in this, up to their necks. And we therefore have to appreciate that the government must support the private sector in creating a defensible architecture and actually defending that architecture, while not allowing or forcing the private sector to take on governmental responsibilities. There are certain responsibilities and authorities that must be retained by government. The ability to make war being one of those, diplomacy being those, speaking on behalf of nations that properly install governments. All of that's a governmental responsibility. But the government must support the private sector, which does most of the work by, with, and through cyberspace.
But effectively, the private sector has a lot of leverage over government because of the way things work as well now.
Well, they do. And so what I'm arguing for is not to essentially cede to each of those stovepipes, those silos, some degree of authority to operate as they do, but to achieve a degree of professional intimacy between those, a collaboration between those. In the United States, for much of our history, we've had a division of effort between the private sector and the public sector. They know one another, they meet at an interface, but each of them has a very different set of authorities, a different set of permissions in terms of how they proceed. And if we only got together and shared our knowledge at the moment of some extreme crisis, we find ourselves way behind, right, the crisis. So we have to actually have a professional intimacy at all levels of that. Before a crisis, during a crisis, and our ability to act together, to intercede, to interdict, and to evict a crisis. Some of the best consultation between the private and the public sector should come as the government attempts to understand what its role can be. We need to take advice and counsel from the private sector. What do you need? How would you have us apply our governmental powers or our engagement of other governments? I think the private sector knows considerably more about the nature of the cyber domain than the government does. And yet they need government's assistance in actually doing the work required in that space.
And the framework, I guess, legislative framework. That
exactly
would
right.
guide it all, yeah.
Exactly right.
Sir, I have to ask you, the recent CrowdStrike outage, the faulty software distribution, cost billions of dollars to businesses. It disrupted flights and medical facilities around the world. And yet it was the result of an error rather than a malicious attack. What do we learn from that about the dangers that exist in essentially what is such a connected world?
Well, that connectivity comes with consequences, some good, some not so good, right? So if you have a singular dependency, some single point of failure, it might be that it has a low probability of failure, but it has an extraordinarily high consequence in that failure, as we learned in the CrowdStrike failure. And so we have to make sure that when we have single points of failure, we redouble our efforts to say it might be a low probability, but given the high consequence, we need to actually redouble our efforts to ensure we got that part right. And perhaps kind of go back and achieve a degree of redundancy or have a backup system in place. That was perhaps most surprising for organizations that depended upon that combination of CrowdStrike and Microsoft. On the day that failed, they had no backup, right? And so you might expect CrowdStrike and Microsoft to address that. I would expect them to. But companies need to actually think their way through, what would I do if this piece of my enterprise failed? And if the answer is, I don't know, then you're taking a risk that you probably don't fully understand, and you certainly are not going to like when it happens.
Well, showing that vulnerability, can cyber defense ever be 100%, or is it just a matter of time before a major cyber attack succeeds and maybe targeting vital infrastructure such as healthcare?
Well, somewhere in between. So to the first question of the three-part question, I would say that cyber defense can never be perfect. It's never possible. It's not possible to have a perfectly secure architecture, something that's impervious to all threats, for all time, that literally defends itself. The changing nature of the software, the hardware, and the engagement of people, right? The choices that they make, and the undulating nature of the assignment of roles response, it's just impossible to make it perfect. So at best, we can make it defensible. I'm not sure we've done that. We've not made it defensible, short of secure. And so I wouldn't say we're going to strive for mediocrity. Let's just make it defensible. That's actually the knee of the curve, which means we then must defend it, right? And so I kind of, on that, the second and third question, which implied, so is it inevitable that we fail? I don't think it's inevitable that we fail. It's inevitable that we meet with a cyber transgression with its criminal or nation state. We meet with one that actually gets through a first level of defense. It's not inevitable that they then succeed. If we know our architecture, which is people and technology and the assignment of roles and responsibilities better than they do, then we can actually be more agile, more maneuverable inside that space. We just have to be vigilant, catch it at the earliest possible moment, engage it, and evict it at the earliest possible moment. We can, in fact, respond well if we've set up such that we're inherently resilient and prepared to respond well. I think that the measure of merit for most companies today is not whether they'll never suffer a breach, but are they actually capable of enduring that breach? Can they actually respond and recover well? And there are a number of companies who've done that, and they march on. And there are companies who've not done that well at all. And the difference between the two is not whether they lived in a dangerous world or they suffered a breach, but were they prepared for that? And it's generally the quality of the team as much as the quality of the architecture that determines that result.
The role you took on was pioneering and must have been quite an eye-opener because it was so kind of new. And I wonder, from that, what did you learn was the biggest threat people face from cybercrime? How well are they being protected? And what responsibility is there for individuals themselves to kind of take the lead?
What's surprising is still what I would describe as the proactive ambivalence on our part. And what do I mean by that? Everyone knows that there's an issue in cyberspace. I mean, there isn't a person that wouldn't say, yep, there's something wrong in that space. And yet so many of us say, I hope somebody else solves this, not realizing or not acknowledging that they have a part to play. And so I would say that there should be consequence kind of imposed on those who transgress in this space. But we should first get our own house in order. Let's use the resources, the assets we already have. We've not done that.
A final thought, sir. It's often said that in cybersecurity, the weakest link is the human. And to make us all feel a bit more human, perhaps I could ask you, have you ever been hacked? Have you ever had your password forgotten or locked? Or, I mean, what have you experienced?
Oh my goodness, yes. Well, maybe not the last part. I forgot my password or kind of locked myself out. Maybe I have. I've lived with systems that, 3 times and you're out and you've got to go see the system administrator. You're kind of, it's that moment of embarrassment and shame. But I had my identity stolen. Someone has filed my taxes as recently as this year. I'm given the publicly available information. And so the question is, am I prepared for that? Do I have some degree of kind of fire gap, between that event and the rest of my financial portfolio? I do, right? I've learned the lessons of those things will happen. And so can you identify it at the earliest possible moment? Can you stop it in its progress? And can you protect the rest of what they've not yet got access to? None of us is inured or safe from this. We're all in the same kind of bucket. And the question is, are you vigilant enough to determine that something is going on that you should engage at the earliest possible moment with the highest possible leverage? And do you have a coalition, right, that you can bring to bear such that whatever's holding you at risk, they got to beat all of you. They got to beat all of us in order to beat the one of us that they're after. I think that's actually the lesson that I've learned over time. And I try to practice that, maybe not perfectly, but ruthlessly day after day.
Well, the fact you had a wake-up call is quite a wake-up call for me, too.
Well, you haven't lived until you try to file your taxes with the federal authorities within the United States, and they said, that's a problem because you already have.
Oh, right? Yeah, so I hope I never come across that. Chris Inglis, thank you, sir, for your time.
Thanks very much. Pleasure to meet you. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you. Well, there's a lesson for us all. If America's former cyber czar can get hacked, we all need to be taking cybersecurity seriously. Well, my next guest is Dr. Richard Stainings, a cybersecurity strategist who's become one of the go-to experts when healthcare systems are threatened. And that includes major data breaches of medical records, hacking digital devices such as pacemakers, and even bringing down entire healthcare networks. Professor Richard Stainings, great to have some time with you, sir.
Hi there.
Now, I wonder, what sort of risks in particular do you feel the healthcare environment faces when it comes to cybersecurity? What are the key ones?
There are many risks across cybersecurity. Lack of funding results in an under-provision of cybersecurity services. Lack of prioritization results in the delay of cybersecurity policies, procedures, controls. And of course, cybersecurity is being impacted by the dramatic change of digital health, right? There is a huge transformation going on within the healthcare industry right now. The inclusion of a multitude of new IoT devices, for example. Artificial intelligence is playing a big part in healthcare moving forward. And these present an expanded risk profile for the industry.
And I'm going to go into those in a bit of detail. You have a lot of experience in this sector, and I wonder from your own perspective, what is your personal worst case scenario?
Worst case scenario is that equipment in a hospital is compromised and used to assassinate a patient, right? That's an extreme risk scenario, and I don't really want to scare anyone who's watching this to think that that might happen in the immediate future, but potentially we have to look at attack vectors within the healthcare sector to understand what perpetrators may decide to do. And it's not just the monetization of stolen intellectual property that is driving cybercriminal activity. We, of course, have heightened geopolitical tensions today, and who's to say what some actor may decide to do in the future.
In doing my research, I think one of the things that struck me the most and was quite terrifying was how a few years ago the FDA in the US, the Food and Drug Administration, recalled devices, pacemakers. It sounds strange to recall a pacemaker because they were vulnerable to cyber attacks. So it makes me wonder, how much of a threat is that in this day and age?
It's a very real threat. Unfortunately, most of our medical devices that are in use, whether they're embedded like a pacemaker or an infusion pump for insulin, for example, or whether they're a large-scale medical device that we use to scan a patient, an X-ray or CT or PET or ultrasound system, for example, or a patient telemetry monitoring system, right? These are all systems that were designed for medical or clinical functionality. They weren't designed with security in mind, and it's only recently, thanks to FDA regulation change last year, that we've begun to see security designed in from the outset, and also medical device manufacturers being held liable to maintain the security of those devices. By that I mean conduct vulnerability assessments, make those vulnerability disclosures available rather than hide them, which has happened in the past, and to release patches in a timely manner so that systems can be updated and upgraded. The problem is the number of legacy medical devices. There are literally millions of medical devices that will be with us for the next 20 years. And those are not subject to the FDA rules. So we have a bit of a gap, as it were, in terms of how do we go about securing those devices.
Who could have imagined in the Internet of Things, as we call it, that includes now people, people having devices in their bodies, even that could be vulnerable. And I guess as technology advances, we're going to have more and more cyber parts, if you want to put it that way, which are going to be even more vulnerable to attacks. So this is a serious concern.
It's very much a serious concern, and you've only got to look at the growth of consumer medical wearables, right? We all walk around with an Apple Watch on our hands, or a Fitbit, or some other device that is tracking our level of physical activity. It's tracking our calorific intake if we program that into, or we enter that data into the system, and that is then being communicated via an mHealth app, right, a mobile health app, to our medical record in many countries. And Australia, as an example, has opened up My Health Record, which is their national health record, to include consumer medical data, so that data that a person generates as a result of their activity is now being entered into their electronic patient record.
Now, one thing that surprised me a lot when you and I had a chat prior to this interview was when you told me that the healthcare systems generate more data, far more data, than all other sectors combined. That just sounds staggering.
Yeah, it is. And the lakes of data should probably not be referred to as lakes anymore. They're more like oceans of data, right? Medical activity creates a massive amount of data, and of clinical treatments, of patient outcomes, all of this sort of data. And that data is extremely valuable to the medical profession in terms of being able to mine that data for AI, for example, for clinical decision support being a classic example, and various other forms of data. But there's also a huge concern with all of that data being generated. How do we go about protecting that data so that it doesn't enter, the public realm or is not stolen by criminals?
Yeah, that was interesting to me, that there have been some really high-profile healthcare breaches affecting tens of millions of people. It was really quite shocking when I did my research. And this concept of medical identity theft was something that surprised me. What is the consequence of such attacks, cyber attacks, for individuals?
So we have seen the increasing level of sophistication of cyber attacks against the healthcare industry over the past decade, right? It used to be that a perpetrator would or a group would infiltrate a hospital system, steal medical records, and then sell those medical records. We're now seeing the industrialization of that criminal activity, so that data is passed out and sold on to other groups. So, for example, personally identifiable information is sold on to identity theft rings, right? Medical data is sold to other groups that may be able to exploit that. Medical insurance data is sold to medical insurance rings. And of course, intellectual property is sold to the highest bidder. Right?
Richard, I can understand people wanting credit card details and things like this for identity theft. But what would they do with the medical information? I mean, where is it valuable to the thieves?
So the first thing is that if you or I were to have our credit card stolen, right, there is a very short lifespan for the criminals to use that particular data, right? Before we recognize that there's something going on with our account, we call our bank and we cancel the card and they issue us a new one, right? And it's in the mail within a couple of days. An inconvenience to us, but the banks are insured against criminal use, and they have anti-fraud systems and can detect nefarious activity very, very quickly. Now, a medical identity has a much, much longer lifespan. So if, for example, I, as a child, had my medical record stolen, I might not realize that until much, much later on in life, right? That information might not need to be exploited straight away. So I could have I could be involved in a hospital data theft, right? Or my identity could be involved in a hospital data theft, and the perpetrators of that crime would have years to exploit it.
So I could see that the people are scared to give out the medical information or have it out there because, for example, trying to get insurance, if the insurance company knows there are certain vulnerabilities a person has, their insurance premium might go up. But in terms of the thieves, what they could do with it, what are the most nefarious kind of uses?
Well, I suppose the most obvious is ransomware, right? It's taking that information, encrypting it to make it unreadable or unavailable, right? And then ransoming that back either to the provider of the healthcare services, the hospital system, or what we're seeing now, secondary and tertiary ransom attacks against individuals, either to persuade those individuals to contact their provider to pay a ransom to the criminals, or directly to pay a ransom to the criminals themselves so that their data is not published or their data can be unencrypted and available for them to use.
What do you believe are the most valuable lessons learned from these major breaches?
I think there are a number of lessons that can be learned. Firstly, criminals are very adept at changing their attack vectors, right? They're very creative in terms of how they exploit data once they've got hold of it, and it's a continuously moving target. And I think that represents some interesting lessons for cybersecurity professionals like myself and others, obviously, about how adept we need to be in terms of our cybersecurity defensive strategies, what tools, what people, what processes we need to bring to bear, and how we really need to prioritize cybersecurity of the healthcare industry given the state of play of the criminal attackers today.
As someone who goes and advises healthcare systems about cybersecurity, how receptive have you found them to be?
I think there's a new openness. A decade ago, I would have these conversations with ministers of health or leaders of healthcare systems around the world, and there was a certain degree of it'll never happen to us, a certain thought that would be the case. I think today there's a realization, a stark realization, that an attack is not only an inevitability, but it's just a question of time. How long and how bad will that attack be? So therefore, leaders of healthcare systems are reconsidering the prioritization of cybersecurity controls in order to protect this critical national asset.
No matter how much advice you give, the weakest link is always the human. So where does the factor of advising individuals come in?
So security education, training and awareness is probably the single biggest bang for buck for any cybersecurity professional in any profession. 97% of successful cyber attacks start with a phishing attempt, right? So if we can present some level of due diligence through training in our staff, then we've, by a large shot, reduced the threat surface to the hospital because all of our staff are working in a single unified manner to ensure patient safety.
Now, are you optimistic that the battle against cyber attacks is being won, or is there such an evolution in the nature of these cyber attacks that we will never be safe?
It's a very good question. I think that the goalposts are moving all the time, right? This is something that is not going to be easily won, a battle that's not going to be easily won. Cyber criminals are highly inventive, and they're always coming up with new attack vectors that they can infiltrate our health data and our health IT systems, for example. The big concern is that we need to mirror those changes, right, in our defense posture in order to protect hospitals, their data, their systems, and obviously patient safety from these sorts of attacks.
Such a worrying term, attack vectors. Professor Richard Stanings, thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Interpol is the world's largest police force. Formed in the aftermath of the First World War, it was established to combat an increasing threat from international crime. Collaboration between countries allowed crime fighting to extend beyond national boundaries. And today, the organization has almost 200 member countries. When it comes to fighting cybercrime, that original principle of collaboration is more important than ever. I met with Dr. Neil Jaton, Interpol's Director of Cybercrime, for an insight into the agency's battle against the hackers. Dr. Jaton, great to have some time with you.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you know, there's this romantic image of what Interpol is. It's like that kind of agents in coffee shops in romantic places like Rome and Paris having secret meetings. It's like the CIA, MI6, I guess. How real is that?
It's spot on. It's exactly like that. It's not really like that. But I don't know what a lot of agencies, you have this romantic feeling for it, and then about what you think in your head, what it's going to be, and then you come in to an agency. So I've been here for 2 months, and I didn't really have too many preconceived notions because I've been a federal agent for a long time. So I've kind of been in this space. But I will say that it has been an amazing experience just for the 2 months. And I think the strength of Interpol and the strength of my team within the Cybercrime Directorate is having, there's only roughly 40 to 50 people. There are only 2 Americans. So you're looking at a wide array of cultures and people and bringing all sorts of strengths from their walks of life.
Tell me what your son said when you said you're joining Interpol.
Yeah. Well, my son was very excited. We were actually watching an action movie at that time when so I was living in D.C., and he was like, oh, like that, like James Bond. And I said, not exactly. And I explained kind of what I was doing, and he was less than impressed with me. But he was also kind of aware of the romantic notions of, being a federal agent and how that is. And he was like, yeah, you're still just dad,
And I guess the cybercrime area on which you focus, you head, is even more that kind of ethereal area.
I mean, it's so emerging and evolving. It is very, very tough. And I don't think when you come into law enforcement, I don't think most people, maybe nowadays, but when I came in 15 years ago, it wasn't to do cyber crimes or crimes, involving computers. You wanted to knock down doors. You wanted to put people behind, bars. You wanted to really be high speed. And I think nowadays the crime, you can almost just get rid of the word cyber and just call it crime, because there's not a lot of crime that's really not connected now to a computer, to a phone, or some other network system. You really see that. So I do think that as you progress through your career, you may have come in saying, I want to combat this type of crime, but it's very clear that you're going to have some sort of cyber background to be successful.
And yet the Hollywood image is that cyber criminals have the chance to take down entire systems. Airports can be shut down, traffic lights can be changed, right. Like the Die Hard 4 kind of thing. Any reality in that?
I think everything's kind of based a little bit in reality, and then movies are, amplified to, a much higher magnitude. But can bad guys target critical infrastructure and be successful? Sure. You looked at the Colonial Pipeline incident in 2021, the U.S.'s largest fuel pipeline, and what the bad guys were able to do was go through the billing system. And you would think that something maybe as innocuous as that wouldn't have such detrimental effects, but it did. The Colonial Pipeline had to shut down the entire company to contain the breach. Large lines at the pump, concern about fuel availability. So it is a reality, but it's not all doom and gloom. I will say that every day we have these sort of conferences where we come together. We talk about how do we improve cybersecurity. So I think we're making great strides.
How did you react when the CrowdStrike incident happened? It was faulty software, so it wasn't really malicious, but I think it exposed a lot of vulnerabilities.
So for us, we are not in the critical infrastructure, cybersecurity, vulnerability business necessarily. We're in the law enforcement business. For any sort of incident, whether it's a CrowdStrike, that wasn't quite, malicious, through something that is, we really are dependent on the member countries' law enforcement to reach out to us for assistance. Or in some cases, maybe we'll have some intelligence through some partners that we're able to push out.
The interesting thing about that incident, though, was that it opened the door for criminals to bounce in quickly.
That's right. I mean, they're always looking. And so, again, I think you have all these national security agencies working diligently trying to identify these vulnerabilities to make it much more difficult for hackers.
It does suggest, though, that the fact they can react quickly to what was not a malicious attack and get their malicious attack in, that they're quite ahead of the game.
I do think it's a little bit of a cat and mouse game. I think that the incentive for the bad guys is financial, so that when you are really focused on making a buck, this is how you earn your living. Of course, you're going to be very, very aggressive in identifying these threats. But I will say that law enforcement, Interpol, is forward-looking, looking at emerging technology, looking at the emerging threats, and trying and try to stay right with the criminals.
As director of cybercrime at Interpol, of course, you get to see the extremes, how bad things could be.
Right.
How worried should we be as citizens?
No, I think you should be concerned. I mean, obviously with emerging technology, but AI, quantum computing, those are obviously some issues. But just as being a parent of a child who I'm finally allowing to have a smartphone for the first time as a teenager, we have had to have sit-down conversations with them about the threats. And I'm like, your dad is the director, cybercrime director at Interpol. You cannot be doing these things. No, you cannot have this app. You're too young. But I'll just say that I think schools are doing a much better job of understanding the issues as well. Parents should take some responsibility, on themselves too.
For many of us, Hollywood is that lens, and cybercrime is seen as young people, sometimes in basements. They're doing things that, from their homes effectively.
Right, in their basements behind their keyboard.
Is it real?
Yeah, I'm assuming, that is quite a bit. I mean, but also it runs the gamut. You may think like, oh, it's a 50-year-old grizzled, person just down in the basement. But no, as you see in some of these ransomware incidents, they're youth. They're not even of legal age, and they're causing this sort of mayhem. So yeah, it's just somebody being able to the ability to have that tech savviness and also the will to actually cause harm. We've seen criminals all ages.
Beyond these, institutions and documents that come out through the UN and so forth, in general, how well is the world keeping up with the threat of cybersecurity? I think well. I mean, obviously, we're always going to. It's really, I think, country dependent. As Interpol, my goal is to bring up those that maybe not as cyber mature, to bring them up to a level so that they can defend themselves, defend their citizens. I do think it's improving. And then you do need legislation, because one of the biggest frustrations in traditional crime is legal loopholes or the lack of legal infrastructure to be able to lock the bad guys away.
Yeah, so, I mean, again, Interpol is not here to tell a country what to do and how to legislate itself, but we do understand that the legality, the laws have to match the emerging crimes, and, in the U.S., they're having the same issue. So that's really not something that we would directly say, person to person. What I would say, though, from any perspective, what I will say, and I'm not saying that government should make it mandatory, but if you are a victim of cybercrime, whether it's anything from being a business being attacked by ransomware, or a child who's a victim of sexual exploitation, is to contact law enforcement. I know that sometimes it can be very, very difficult to make that, because you're now suffering through the worst day of your life, and now you have to go talk to law enforcement about it. But if you really want to make I think, receive some justice and then help future victims, it is to, reach out to law enforcement.
Now, I know you don't tell governments how to legislate and so on, but I do wonder how much it impedes what you can do when it actually comes to enforcing what you're doing.
So for us, our enforcement is only through our member countries' law enforcement agencies. So it's really upon them. We'll provide them as much information, as much support as we can, and then it's on their individual governments what they do with the end of their legislation.
How, again, going to this idea that hackers can create widespread havoc, How much is this kind of DDoS, a term that's come into our vocabulary now, distributed denial of service? How much of a threat is that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you see, so DDoS attacks, that's the slang for it, but
DDoS,
yeah, that's okay. So obviously it is a significant avenue of attack. But we, again, if a company or if a business or an entity is suffering from a DDoS attack or any sort of cyber attack, my point of view, and I think you would talk to anybody from law enforcement, is reach out to your local law enforcement, have them, and if they need support, then come to Interpol and Cybercrime Directorate, and we'll do more than anything that we can. We'll do anything that we can help.
Dr. Jaton, what is the biggest challenge that you're facing right now? What eats up your time and resources?
Well, I would always say that funding and finding personnel. Interpol, we bring in seconded officers. So basically, like myself, I come from the U.S. My home agency pays for me. I am on loan to Interpol for a few years. So it's getting those agencies from all different countries. And we want a wide spectrum. I would have like somebody from every region to come in and be a part of our team. So it's finding, the personnel, it's finding the funding for the different projects that we have. Those are the things that really take a lot of my time.
I guess the great thing about being such a diverse group of people at Interpol is that you do take back these skill sets with you and share them.
Yeah, that's the selling point. Like, we want your best and your brightest. You come to us because I know it's also a sort of a catch-22 when you send somebody who's so good, now they're not with you anymore in your home agency. So I understand that, but my hope is that when you come to us, when you leave in the 3 years, whether sometimes they're short-term secondments for a year, sometimes they're 3 years or extended, my hope is that when you go back, you use the skills that you develop, especially like the diplomacy skills, the ability to mediate, those sort of skills that you may not get as a police officer, as an agent. You take those skills back and enhance your agency.
You explained how this isn't really what you got into. You weren't really going into cybercrime,
right.
But of course everything's evolved and it's continually evolving. So is AI, artificial intelligence, your friend or enemy, for example?
No. I think any emerging technology, I'll just say, in my opinion, it's neutral. So it's whoever it's in the hands of, whatever the intent is, that's really whether it's good or bad. And so we understand the criminality, the uses of it, and criminals are always going to take advantage, whether it's AI, quantum computing. I mean, it was computers, 20 years ago, and smartphones and apps and all that. Whatever emerging crime, there's going to be some ingenious criminal who's going to try to find it and exploit it. So again, it's on us as law enforcement to be forward-looking, to say, hey, these are the emerging threats, and how can we combat that? And so within Interpol, we do have an innovation center that's also housed with Singapore that's looking at those very concerns.
This sounds like an echo of guns don't kill people,
yeah,
people kill
it's
people.
The same. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to compare
of course,
one to the other, but again, it really is how you use it, because I think there's going to be some great uses with AI, obviously, and then obviously it's going to be some negatives.
I think the way I've heard you put it is that basically technology is agnostic.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's how I feel.
In terms of keeping up with everything, do you have the resources to be able to keep up?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, could we always use more funding? Could we always use more personnel? Of course. I mean, any agency could. But what we should do, and I think in Cybercrime Directorate, is we should be more forward leaning and continued sustained communications with our 196 member countries to actually ask them, what do you need? Because we may think from Singapore, these are the cyber concerns that we think you should be concerned about, and yet it may not be. So that's part of my strategy, is to conduct outreach with those members to say, what exactly do you need from Interpol?
How do you regard the term cyber psychology, and how does that fit in with what you do?
For me, from a law enforcement perspective, what I want to always look at is when we go and interview a victim, whether the victim is a business, a hospital, and have to talk to the CISO who's now suffering through stress, and I'm not comparing them, or to talk to somebody who's been a victim of some sort of sexual exploitation, especially with children, is to understand that is their worst day. And so for law enforcement, I think our goal is always to get the evidence, to get the interview, and then go on and catch the bad guy and stop the next thing from happening. But I think from law enforcement, we have to take a step back and realize that these are some bad days, the worst days that these people are suffering through, to show them some grace, show them some kindness at the same time.
Technology is moving fast, but let me wrap up by asking you if you could paint me a picture of what the cybercrime scene might look like maybe a decade from now.
So, I mean, I wish I had a magic ball and I knew who to invest in, which companies were going to be a part. But obviously AI, I mean, that's the buzzword, AI. I think quantum, computing and the encryption that's going to, become problematic in the future. I think those are things that I'm sure criminals are already salivating at the thought of. I think that there are the law enforcement and other government agencies that are also looking at that and saying, no, we're going to be ready for this. We're going to, maybe not everything, but we're actually, the focus isn't just going to be on for the criminals. We're actually going to concentrate on these things too. So I will just say, though, that Interpol has been in existence. We just celebrated our 100th anniversary last year. So 1923 to 2023. And so in 10 years, I think the Interpol and Interpol's cybercrime directorate will still be combating, transnational cybercrime and still being a good partner to 196 member countries.
Dr. Neil Jaton, thank you very much. Good luck with your work.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Let's continue that theme of cyber psychology with a woman whose work in the field inspired the hit TV crime drama CSI Cyber. In fact, her character is played by an Oscar-winning Hollywood actress. As many experts will tell you, humans are often regarded as the weakest link when it comes to cybersecurity. Dr. Mary Aiken's work includes profiling hackers and identifying their vulnerabilities. But she's ready to back her own brain against AI any day. Dr. Mary Aiken, great to have a chance to chat with you because it's been fascinating to find out the kind of areas you cover. Now, I do want to start, though, with your role on CSI Cyber, how you've been portrayed there. Tell me about that.
Yes, actually, I was doing some work for the White House on tech solutions to human trafficking, and there was some publicity around it, and afterwards I got a call from William Morris, and I thought it was Philip Morris, the cigarette company, okay. So I said, I don't do endorsements. Anyway, turned out to be an agency. They brought me to Hollywood. I met some people, and the next thing, they created a division of the show, CSI New York, CSI Miami, CSI Cyber, based on my work, and Patricia Arquette played me in the show.
That's pretty good. Huh? It's like your work's at least getting some visibility there as well. And I want to ask you, how much does a TV series like that actually portray the reality?
I think that, they're metaphors. So when we're talking about something in a television show, what we're trying to do is sort of provide explanatory value. We're trying to educate general population. So there's a famous scene that we did had this operator looking at code on the screen, and it was all green, and all of a sudden the malware showed up as red, and the operator said, oh, we've got malware. And of course the InfoSec community went crazy because they said, that's not how it works. Malware doesn't jump out as red code. But it was a metaphor that an experienced operator would see it as red code. Of course, there was all this trouble online about it and how we were dumbing down, computer science and InfoSec. And then the US Army cavalry came to my rescue in the form of West Point. And they wrote an article in defense of CSI Cyber saying how important it was. The series aired in 170 countries worldwide.
One thing is new to a lot of people is this term cyber psychology. Explain that in a simple way.
Cyber psychology is the study of the impact of technology on human behavior. It's about 20 years old as a discipline, which is really young. And I'm one of the pioneers in the field. I'm a professor of cyber psychology in London, and I'm a professor of forensic cyber psychology in the US. Forensic cyber psychology is the study of criminal, deviant, and abnormal behavior, and I'm kept pretty busy.
I'm sure. And I love the fact you're not scared to speak your mind, because I know you don't really like the term cyber resilience. Explain why.
Yes, so we're here at GCF, and we had a panel earlier today talking about cyber resilience, well, cognitive resilience particularly. And I suppose, as a cyber behavioral scientist, you often come across these terms, and my guess is, and yeah, I'm probably right, I'm sure it was a term invented by a computer scientist who said, well, we've got resilience in systems, and they can, be resilient during an attack, and then they can bounce back quickly afterwards. So let's retranspose that construct to humans, and then develop resilience in humans. My point is that, okay, if we're going to talk about resilience, let's talk about the psychology of resilience. So across the general population, if you had, say, 4 people in a family, there's a strong genetic component. One person will have no resilience, 2 of them will be 50-50 on resilience, and 1 will be extremely resilient. So I object to the term because where are we going with collective cybersecurity? Is it a Darwinian push towards survival of the tech fittest? That's not fair.
So really, that is an interesting thought. Tech fittest or cyber fittest, in effect. Someone who can handle that. Basically, that suggests it's not just a simple vertical silo. It's not something that can be handled in a simple way. It has to be a much broader understanding.
I think you've got to factor the human into the equation and not in a sort of, scientific or computer science or infosec science way of sort of an approximation of what it is to be human. When we talk about protecting critical infrastructure, what is the most critical infrastructure that we're trying to protect? It's humans, it's us, our families, our communities, our cities, our nations. That's what we're trying to protect, is the humans.
From your research and all that you've seen in your studies, how much more vulnerable are we now? The fact we all have devices, young people have access to almost everything. You say cyberpsychology, the impact of this technology on our minds, it must be pretty intense.
Well, when things go wrong, look, there are a lot of things that are great about tech. I was just asked earlier about internet addiction and how do I control my technology use. I'm probably the worst person. I'm a cyber psychologist. I spend a disproportionate amount of my time online. But the point is, in terms of you and I, we're sort of done, we're cooked. Like, not a lot is going to go wrong in terms of our neural activity and our use of technology. But the developing child, when I see 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds with mobile phone devices, when, millions of neurons are making connections, we have to think about that. There's a great paper by the American Academy of Pediatrics, and it's called The Good, the Bad, and the Unknown. I worry about the unknown in terms of the impact of technology on the developing child.
How much real thought is being given to this right now? Because everyone seems to run at such a fast pace. Do people pay enough attention to this potential unknown?
I think that to a certain extent, parents have sort of given up. It's too much. They're trying to manage and juggle their busy lives. The kids seem happy on their devices. And there's not enough education and awareness raising about the impact of that technology in a good way, in terms of enhancing fine motor skills and, the deficits associated with that and the problems associated with age-inappropriate use of technology. So I think we just have to be, we need, in the real world, we have ages of development. If you have children, you knew what age they should sit up and say their first words and take their first step. What's the equivalent in a cyber context in terms of ages of cyber development? And how do we inform parents about that?
Now, when people talk about cyber threats, cyber attacks and so on, I know you also have a very clear perspective on this because they do vary.
Yes, again, we were discussing earlier and somebody was saying, a cyber attack is a major event and then everything else should be considered a cyber incident. I don't agree with that. If somebody broke into your home and hit you over the head and went upstairs and pulled up your mattress and took, your savings, $10,000 from under your bed, that's an attack. When somebody is targeted online in terms of cyber fraud or extortion in terms of an investment that goes wrong, which is, cyber fraudulent investment, and somebody loses their life's savings and they're humiliated and incredibly depressed as a result, that's an attack. If a young boy is coerced into a relationship online and then sextorted as a result, that's an attack. If a small business is held to ransom and people lose their livelihood in terms of a ransomware attack, that's not an incident. That is an attack.
How do you regard disinformation and deep fakes and fake news? What sort of attack do they present then?
I think disinformation, and we've seen in the UK recently how disinformation online can lead to public disorder. And, there's a symbiotic relationship between cyberspace and the real world. What happens in cyberspace impacts the real world. What happens in the real world impacts cyberspace. So when you get this massive amounts of mis and disinformation online, it can lead to public order incidents. I mean, we saw that with the March on Capitol Hill in the US, and mis and disinformation, the potential impact in terms of elections. Mis and disinformation for young people. There was a recent piece of research, and something like 60% of young people thought that mainstream media was disinformation, fake news. So how are we going to maintain social order and civil society when people can no longer trust sources?
You're a pioneer in cyber psychology, and AI has come in now. Everything's moving so fast. How hard is it for you to keep up, and what impact is AI going to have?
Oh, I can beat AI any day, hands down. I mean, I've got a million-year-old piece of technology that's been in development for 1 million years, the human brain. On any given day, that is going to beat AI. AI, we mistake it as human intelligence because it can do some things incredibly quickly. That's not intelligence. That's just a task. That's like sweeping versus using a hoover. You know, it's not intelligence. As a behavioral scientist, I can categorically say that we barely understand how the human brain works. To create something that replicates something we don't understand, it's a false premise. So I think what we have to do is look at not AI replacing humans, but IA, intelligence augmentation, the work of Licklider, who wrote in 1950 about man-computer symbiosis, that symbiotic relationship between man and machine, placing the human at the center of the decision-making process.
Let's end with perhaps 3 bullet point pieces of advice to people on how they can build their sense of strength against this, how they can, if you like, manage their cyber psychology.
I think the first thing that people need to do is understand the potential impact of technology on their lives. The second thing they've got to do is educate themselves about what the possibilities are and what strategies they could deploy. And then the third strategy is actually deploy. Do it. Just do it.
Dr. Mary Aiken, what a pleasure. Thank you so much. I look forward to speaking with you again.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Sound advice from cyber psychologist Dr. Mary Aiken. I leave you with one final thought. If you're hearing about cybersecurity for the first time, you might not know that the US has declared October to be Cybersecurity Awareness Month. Even more surprising is the fact that it first did so 20 years ago. The battle continues. And that's all for this edition of the show. I'm Riz Khan. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday on Al Arabiya News. I'm Rosanna Lockwood. Coming up on the show, Donald Trump heads to Austin as both candidates competing for the White House take their campaigns to Texas. Kamala Harris is joined by a host of celebrities as she rallies in Houston. The polls show the race is on a knife edge. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken holds talks with Lebanese Prime Minister in London as Washington urges Israel to limit its military campaign against Hezbollah. And Israel says it will send negotiators to Qatar to discuss a potential Gaza deal amid rising casualties from its military operations in the enclave. I'm joined now by Mick Mulvaney, who served as White House Chief of Staff during the Trump administration. Thanks for making time for us. And look, the candidate's going to Texas. Shouldn't this be a slam dunk for Trump? Will it be?
The state will be yes for the presidential election. He's going to do a podcast, a very popular podcast with a celebrity named Joe Rogan. She's going for an entirely different reason, which I actually understand and sort of agree with. The one issue that the Democrats continually lead the Republicans on in the polling is abortion. Texas has some of the most restrictive abortion laws in the country, and she is apparently going to Texas in order to try and bring some attention to the larger issue. So even though she doesn't have a chance in Texas, abortion will be a big issue in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. There's also the subtext, Rosanna, that there's a fairly competitive Senate race. Republican Senator Ted Cruz is leading by only a couple of points in the recent polls over his Democrat challenger. So maybe the Democrat Party writ large would like to see Kamala Harris in Texas a little bit in order for her to help the Democrat candidate there.
I mean, given the point you made there about the abortion laws and also, Roe v. Wade living in a lot of women in America's collective memory at the moment, is there a chance that Harris could get through to some female voters in Texas?
Oh, sure. It's not going to move the needle. I think she's down by 8 or 10 points in Texas. But again, it could help the Senate race, which would help the Democrat Party. And it's also going to be a news cycle now. Even though she's in Texas, everything is nationalized in this country now through social media and the press. So this message on abortion will obviously be seen by voters in the swing states. So it's a smart move. It's similar to the reason that Donald Trump went to Colorado a few weeks ago to talk about immigration. He doesn't have a chance to win Colorado, but it's a big issue in Colorado because the Venezuelan gangs are active in that state. And he was able to drive a news cycle that would have been seen by voters in the states that he can win.
Interesting. Look, you mentioned that Trump, of course, going on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast. It will speak a lot to a lot of people, given it's the biggest podcast, but a lot to young men as well. Let's talk about it. I mean, how significant is that for him, do you think? Rosanna, it's an interesting question. This is really the first election in my adult lifetime where I can remember that your gender is probably the greatest indicator of how you're going to vote. Trump is overperforming dramatically with men across the board. And Kamala Harris is doing much better with women than one might expect. Usually your economic condition, your race, your geography would tell us more about how you intend to vote. But this is really almost turning into a male versus female election. I know that's a dramatic oversimplification, but it not surprised me that Trump is on Joe Rogan speaking to men and Kamala Harris is in Texas speaking to women. Yeah, and she went on Call Me Daddy, which is the biggest podcast, I think second biggest in the US, and obviously the biggest with women generally. Interesting point there before we go on then. What would happen, do you think, if Harris won and we saw the first female US president in the White House, of which many people say it's about time for that? Would you see, what socially do you think that would do to young men who really wanted Trump in?
I don't think it would be that big a deal. Look, we've had this conversation recently when the Democrats passed over the Jewish governor of Pennsylvania. And there was some discussion about whether or not the country was ready for a Jewish vice president. And a lot of us just scratched our head and said, yeah, sure we are. What's the issue? Look, we've had a female vice president now. We have very prominent female governors. We have very prominent female senators. Nancy Pelosi has been leading the House effectively, either effectively or actually for almost 20 years, or at least the Democrats in the House. So, no, I don't think the gender is an issue at the top of the ticket. May it impact a small handful of voters in pockets here and there? Yes. But I don't know if that's any different here than it is anyplace else in the world.
Yeah. Look, should Kamala Harris be doing the Joe Rogan Experience as well? It's sort of said that her diary just didn't match up. She's not available to do it.
Look, it's interesting when you get down to the final weeks of the election, you have to decide, are you trying to reach out to possibly still undecided voters, of whom there are very few, or should you be spending your time trying to make sure your voters get out and vote, sort of motivating what we call the base? I'm not sure that Kamala Harris gets many votes by going on the Joe Rogan Experience any more than I think that, Donald Trump goes on Call Her Daddy, the podcast. So Democrats, I think, have made a decision that they want to try and turn out their base. That's why they're talking about abortion. I don't think that's the wrong decision.
Really interesting, the thinking that goes behind a lot of this strategy, and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, let's talk about for a moment, before we get on to more serious matters, but celebrity endorsements, because the jury's out about how useful they are, how powerful they are. But Beyonce said to be going on stage with Kamala Harris. Is that powerful?
No. The only one I think that matters in this election cycle was Taylor Swift. And I say that in all seriousness, just because of the demographic of her base. Her fan base is predominantly younger single women. To the extent that endorsement is able to drive that particular demographic group to register to vote, which you have to do in this country, obviously, and then obviously to vote after that, that could make a difference. This race is going to be so tight, Rosanna, that an extra 10,000, 20,000 young single female voters in Michigan might turn not only that particular state, but the outcome of the overall campaign as well. So generally speaking, it was nice to have the Hulk Hogan at the Republican convention. The Democrats love having Bruce Springsteen last night at a campaign event for Kamala Harris. Generally, those things don't move the needle. If anybody does, it might be Taylor Swift.
Interesting. Look, you're saying there the race is going to be tight. It's what we're hearing across the board. The polls keep coming back. You know, one candidate inches slightly ahead of the other and then they lose. It's almost impossible to call. Some people on Wall Street say they know who's going to win. They always say that, though. Look, in terms of how tight it's going to get, have you got concerns that we're going to end up in kind of recounts and litigation?
I do, and I'm concerned that it's going to take Pennsylvania at least 5 or 6 days to count their ballots. It may take Arizona 5 or 6 days. It takes Florida a couple of hours. Keep in mind that each state has its own rules on how it counts. Those states could choose to count them in an efficient manner. They choose not to. And I do think the longer it plays out, the more it will undermine sort of confidence in the decision. But that's the way it is. It took us 46 days in 2000 to figure out who won between George Bush and Al Gore. So we can handle that. That's not a problem. As to the polling, look, I did a TV program last week at another network, and we had different polling every night of the week. And Donald Trump was winning in Pennsylvania on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and Kamala Harris was winning on Tuesday and Thursday. That's just how close it is. I will say this very quickly, Rosanna. I've talked to some folks in the Trump campaign. They are ecstatic about the polling data, and here's why. In 2016, they were down by between 7 and 10 points in some of these polls. Similar numbers against them in 2020. They won in 2016. They lost narrowly in 2020. For them to be tied in polling, to them is a giant green flag that things are going very, very well. So you hear some folks talk about, a clear-cut decision on election night for just that reason. I'm sort of with you. I think it could take a couple of days and could drag out longer than folks are comfortable with.
I mean, if it got to that point of 2000, longer than 40 days, multiple recounts, obviously you guys are well set up for that in the US, you're willing to wait. But, elsewhere we've been talking to experts about the situation still happening here in the Middle East and, efforts to negotiate a ceasefire in Gaza, for example. And some voices saying to us, well, nothing will really happen in earnest because everyone's waiting for the outcome of the US election. So there's an argument that the rest of the world really can't wait that long. Is that something that, is going to be of a concern to anyone stateside?
It's an argument. It's a valid point. It's probably true and accurate. It's not going to make a difference. No one in Pennsylvania is going, oh my goodness, if we don't have an answer in 5 days, then it might affect the war in Ukraine. It might affect the situation in Gaza or Lebanon. That's not how the local officials in Pennsylvania are going to look at it. So your point is well made and accurate. It's not going to move the needle very much. So I hate to say it like that, but this is a very parochial process that we go through. We vote, 300 million people will vote, maybe 250 million people will vote, and we'll do it in 50 different ways in 50 different states. And the impact on foreign policy probably doesn't hit the radar of those local groups.
Yeah, I mean, fair point, well made. Your president, not ours, but of course the knock-on effect worldwide is always enormous as to who you guys choose. Let's talk Trump a moment, because of course you did serve as chief of staff during a previous administration. If he doesn't win, will he accept defeat?
I think it depends. I think it depends on how close it is, why it's so close, how long it takes. Look, if he loses by 10 points, I think that's a different story. I don't know how you don't accept that easily as opposed to something that's very, very close. I think it depends on which states he loses in. Pennsylvania, for example, it's a Democrat-controlled state. Georgia is a Republican-controlled state. North Carolina is split between the two parties. So there's a bunch of different possible answers to your question, but it's just as easily asked of the other side. There have been some very high-profile interviews in this country of prominent Democrats in the House and the Senate asking them if they will accept the outcome of an election. And their answer is across the board pretty much the same, which is that depends on if it's fair. I happen to think that's the right answer. You can't say in advance, well, I'm going to be okay with the election if I thought it was really, really fraudulent. No party would say that. No one would say that in good conscience. So, look, I hope it's clean cut. I hope there's a clear cut winner and a loser. I hope it's as expeditiously as possible. And I hope that if there are any charges of fraud by either side, that those are adjudicated quite quickly so that the country and the world, to your point, can settle on who is actually the winner so that we can move on to the next administration.
Is there an issue with fraud in the US electoral system?
Oh, sure. There always is. And it's not the type that gets a lot of the attention. It's not people voting 2 or 3 times, people voting under fake names. It's not immigrants voting or felons voting. That there is the opportunity for fraud. We have examples of fraud in the past here of circumstances where mail-in ballots really can be manipulated. We call it ballot harvesting. So it's against the law in some states. It's sort of against the law in other states. It's not against the law in others. So, yeah, when you vote as many millions of people as we do, and keep in mind, 95% of the people who conduct these elections will be volunteers. I'm not making that up. Most of this election is run by part-time volunteers that are coming out for a couple of days of training, and then they actually sit through the election day. There's always the opportunity for fraud. So, yes, I think to say there's no opportunity is that's just a little naive.
Now, listen, some of Trump's detractors still pointing out, of course, that one of the big motivations for him still running for office is all of the, convictions and charges he's facing, his legal issues, and that, if he doesn't win the White House, he could indeed end up behind bars. We haven't heard Trump, or at least I don't believe I have for quite a while, talking about Operation, quote, lawfare, as he called it, which was a big part of his early campaign and when all the charges were coming out earlier this year and he was in court a couple of times. Is it that strategy wasn't working?
No, I actually think it did work. It revived his campaign. It propelled him, I think, to the Republican nomination. His campaign was lacking very, very badly at it when it first came out. People forget when he announced he was running for re-election in November of, I think it was 2022, right after our midterm elections. Fox News, which is the right-leaning sort of pro-Trump network, broke away from the speech to cover other things. So he was not getting a lot of energy. He was able to use that argument about lawfare to sort of propel him, make him out to be the victim. His message in the campaign very early on, you even heard this, Rosanna, up through the Republican National Convention just a couple months ago, was, look what they're doing to me. I'm white and I'm rich and I'm famous. If they're doing it to me, imagine what they can do to you. Elect me and I'll make sure that doesn't happen. That was a very compelling argument. Yes, you have seen him move away from it as we get closer to the general election. I think that's because the polling data has indicated that the economy is probably the biggest issue, and the economy is his strongest issue vis-a-vis Kamala Harris. So you're right, he has moved away from it. You're right, he does have the risk if he loses. By the way, he has some risk even if he wins, because some of the state charges against him would not be stayed while he's in the White House. That's a unique sort of circumstance we've never faced before in this country. But I don't think it's to say that it didn't work for him, because I think it probably did.
Let's say he wins. What type of presidency are we going to see? And I'm going to give you some quotes here from the Watergate journalist Bob Woodward. Of course, he's released this book about, Trump as a leader in foreign policy, etc. But he says Trump doesn't, quote, understand the presidency or its responsibilities. Trump is unable to separate national interest from self-interest. And Trump has captured the Republican Party, so people are marching to him. He's marching the country and the Republicans off a cliff. Let's take those. I mean, what do you think of him saying that Trump doesn't understand the presidency?
Yeah, with all of those, I know Bob Woodward. I've met him several times. I arranged meetings between him and President Trump when I was the chief of staff. I do not hold him in high regard. I believe he is capable of spinning stories that are in a way that is very detrimental to President Trump. So I have to say, I take all of what he just said with a giant grain of salt. I think the question that you raise and that he sort of hints at in those quotes that you pulled is interesting. What kind of presidency would it be? In many ways, I think it might be more of the same from the first Trump presidency. What I tell people is what you liked about Donald Trump in his first term, you're going to like even more. What you didn't like, you're going to dislike even more. That's because he knows a little bit more and his team knows more about how to run a White House. Keep in mind, I don't think anybody really expected him to win in 2016, so he didn't do the preparatory work. They are doing the preparatory work now, so I think they'll be able to hit the ground running. But I also think there's a counterbalance to that, which is that it's a second term. He's immediately going to be a lame duck. And I think he starts to work on his legacy, as so many second-term presidents do. I think he's running primarily, Rosanna, because he wants to win. I think he wants to erase the 2020 loss and to a certain extent try to erase January 6th from his resume, from his brand, so to speak. So I think it's very difficult to say what he'd do in the second term because it's not really clear whether or not he's going to be focusing on policy, focusing on getting stuff done, or sort of, taking a victory lap saying, look, I won and I'm not the loser that folks have made me out to be from 2020.
Interesting, that point on January 6th. You feel like he now wants to distance himself from it, kind of readdress the scorecard a little bit. I mean, again, you don't hear him as much trying to write it off. You still do a little bit and saying, well, there were some good people on that day. A lot of it is overblown. Is it that he's still trying to walk this balance of not alienating the serious kind of his QAnon core, if you like, from his other supporters? Apologies.
No,
Nick.
I think that those folks are going to support him anyway. You have heard him talk recently, by the way, about it was a loving engagement. It was a loving whatever the word it was. I was scratching my head as to how he came up with that. I've seen the videos. I was actually in the building earlier that same day on January 6th. But I think what he's primarily interested in, Rosanna, is this. If he loses, then history will be written in such a fashion that focuses on January 6th, that he was the president, that he led an armed insurrection, that it failed, that he ran again for president, and he failed. That's what he really, really doesn't want. He thinks if he wins in 2024, and I think to a certain extent he can make this argument plausibly, that it will sort of atone for the sins, but erase for the mistakes of January 6th, that the American public looked at him and said, you know what, we're not really sure what happened on January 6th, but we'd still like you to be our president again. That's what I think this race is about. That's what I think this campaign is about. So I don't know if he's trying to move away from January 6th. I don't know if he's trying to finesse the issue. I don't get that impression at all. I still think he thinks that there was nothing wrong with January 6th, but he's really focusing on this election as a way to make sure that history treats him and his brand better than it otherwise would.
Mick Mulvaney, former White House Chief of Staff during the Trump administration. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, for more on how both candidates are faring, I'm joined now by Assistant Secretary of State in the Obama administration and author of Redline, American Foreign Policy in Times of Fractured Politics and Failing States, PJ Crawley. Sir, good of you to make time for us. Thank you. And let's just start by getting your opinion on Texas, what they're both trying to achieve there. Surely a bit of a safe state for Trump. So what's it going to be like for Harris?
Well, sure. No, I'm sitting in Virginia, which is half the country away from Texas. Texas has been a reliably what we call red state, a Republican state. Democrats have inched closer in terms of margins. But right now I would put Texas in the Trump column. There are, 6 or 7 states that are genuinely competitive. They will decide the election. Texas is not one of them.
Interesting. Now, I'm going to be speaking elsewhere on the show to people about the tightness of the polls, but I want to get your opinion on it too, because really neck and neck at the moment. I think it's fair to say every time we get a new poll out, one is inched slightly ahead of the other. Are we heading into a sort of recount and litigation side of things?
Well, the latest national poll that I saw today, of a high quality, literally places the race at 50-50. And I think that's where we are. We are evenly divided country. And so for both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, it will be all about turnout and turnout in specific locations. That will decide the election. I think the only prediction that we can make at this point is that when we all go to bed on election night, we will not know who the winner is.
Yeah, and that is making a lot of people anxious, actually, worldwide. I'll say not just there in the US, but there's a lot riding on this election. Pretty pivotal. Let's talk about anxieties, though. And given you were in a Democrat administration, I'd like to kind of get your opinion on how Harris is performing, because when she came out as being a contender, when Biden sort of stepped aside after that debate, there was a lot of positivity, there was a lot of energy, there was a lot of real feeling that there was a lot of tide behind Kamala Harris, pushing her along, and she was well ahead in quite a lot of the polls. Is there some anxiety now that she's fallen back, that she's not being able to deliver as much?
Well, I'm not sure that I would say that she has fallen back. You know, she has energized, you know, the Democratic Party that had anxiety about, you know, Joe Biden, that, you know, despite a very successful 4 years in office, you know, was perceived as someone who might or might not be able to perform well in a second term. So she has you know, maintained her base, and that's kind of where we are. You know, Harris is speaking primarily to her supporters. Trump is speaking to his supporters. And the great question in the United States today is, you know, are there genuinely undecided voters? I'm not sure there are many. You know, far more significant is that you'll have a cadre of people in the United States who are not enthusiastic about either candidate. And the question is, are they going to do? Are they going to, you know, vote for someone at the end of the day, or are they going to sit home? You know, that calculation will tell you, you know, in specific states, you know what, you know, that's what makes this so unpredictable. Is at the end of the day, who comes out to vote, and then who do they vote for? I mean, has either candidate managed to take some people from the other camp? I know it's hard to know at this time, we just don't know. But for example, Trump has been working hard to try and win over Black and Latino voters, for instance. And there is some discussion that he's gaining ground in these crucial sort of blue wall states. Do you think he's succeeding in speaking to new audiences? You know, that's really interesting. You know, there's a lot of analysis here that we are in the midst of a shift in terms of what the, you know, alignment is. You know, a lot has traditionally depended on the economy. If people feel good about the economy, they tend to vote for the party in power. If people are uncertain about the economy, they tend to vote that party out of power. You know, here we seem to be moving a little bit from, you know, elections based on perceptions of the domestic economy, you know, to something else. You know, education is a factor, culture is a factor, and you know, so you know, the challenge for anyone running for president today is to kind of figure out, you know, are there voters who are gettable that you can in fact take from one side and bring to the other. You know, we've had, you know, profound shifts in the recent past. People, for example, who voted for Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012, and who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020. And when you look at Obama and Trump, those are two candidates representing vastly different, you know, policies and vastly different relationships with the rest of the country. So I think, you know, but where people have settled, I think, you know, we are in fact a 50-50 question, and it remains to be seen, you know, are there swing voters in the country? There may or may not be. Yeah, I mean, what do you make of the way that both candidates have gone after the younger vote this time around? Because I think it's been interesting to watch how much they've embraced TikTok, podcasts, other types of what we might call new media that speaks a lot more to younger generations. Do you think there's going to be a big young turnout in this election? Very good question. You know, for example, you know, step from the presidential elections to congressional elections in the off years. Young voters have been decisive, and young voters have tended to drift to the left. The main challenge with young voters is to what extent do they vote at all? And because they're not yet locked into one party or the other, on the one hand, yes, they can be persuaded, but the first order of business is, can they be persuaded to vote? And then can they be persuaded to vote for one side, or the other? But, young voters, that's a block that people are trying to reach through non-traditional political means.
Let's go back to discussing Harris and some of her tactics. I want to talk to you about her use of language recently, but also, I'll come back to that, but Michigan being an all-important state, swing state, but also with a huge Arab American vote, and Gaza and the situation in the Middle East probably weighing quite heavy on a lot of voters' minds. Is there a sense that some of them feel that the Biden administration has not delivered what they'd like to see in terms of reigning in Israel, and that will affect their vote?
There's no question that there's anger within that constituency in Michigan. They have taken a position publicly that they are not endorsing one side or the other. And let's understand that, notwithstanding their frustration with the Biden administration, President Trump was and is, very much, pro-Israel as well. And I think this, Michigan is a critical state. For Kamala Harris to be elected, she probably needs to win Michigan. If she can't win Michigan, she has to win another state, perhaps Georgia, for example. But I think this is a snapshot of where the election is. If the Arab American voters decide to boycott the election, to stay home, what does that do to the balance, in that state? That will be one of the major questions on Election Day.
Now, turning to that point of language, Kamala Harris in recent days calling Trump an unserious man, weird, fascist, increasingly unhinged and unstable. Now, Democrats famously have long sort of stuck to that line of when they go low, we go high. Clearly not being the case at the moment. And she also campaigned on the original message of bringing joy back to politics. Is there a sense now that she's having to change her strategy in these final days?
I think some of that language is directed at Republicans who are more traditional Republicans, who are turned off by Trump. But the question is, are they so turned off by Trump that they're going to vote for Harris or simply write in someone else? So I think part of that is you've had here in the United States in recent days some former significant military figures, some former figures who worked for Trump during his first term, who said he's really not fit for office. Yes, I think that's going after a particular, very narrow, segment of vote. But I think that's where we are. Given that it's a 50-50 election, you're going after a handful of vote here, here, and here to try to figure out how you get to the magic number of 270 electoral votes.
Indeed, that magic number. Look, while we've got you, I'd love to talk to you about the book that you read. I believe it was back in 2016 with the title American Foreign Policy in a Time of Fractured Politics and Failing States, because that could very well describe where we are today in 2024. Yes. Do you think things have declined further since you wrote the book?
Certainly in terms of fractured politics, I think that is definitely true. How you fashion a foreign policy today that you can call bipartisan is very, very difficult. Here again in the election, you have one candidate who's going, well, I'm really not interested in Ukraine. You have another candidate who says, I will stand with Ukraine as long as it takes. Under traditional politics, that would be soundly bipartisan in nature, but it's not. So I don't think that foreign policy is going to drive the result, but certainly the result of the election is going to have a profound effect on the future of American foreign policy and how the United States relates to the rest of the world.
Really interesting. Thank you. Look, P.J. Crawley, the author of that book and also Assistant Secretary of State in the Obama administration previously. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken met with Lebanese Prime Minister Najib Mikati in London on Friday, as Washington has been urging Israel to limit its military campaign against Hezbollah in Lebanon. Blinken arriving in London late Thursday after a three-nation tour of the Middle East, where he emphasized the need to protect Lebanese civilians but did not call for an immediate ceasefire from Israel. Prime Minister Mikati making the trip from Paris after attending a conference focused on aid for Lebanon, which successfully raised some $1 billion in humanitarian and military assistance. Blinken did not attend the Paris summit himself, sending a deputy in his place. Now, all of this comes as Lebanon's health ministry says an Israeli airstrike killed 3 journalists and injured several others in southern Lebanon. Camera operator Hassan Najjar and engineer Mohammed Reda from the pro-Iranian Al Mayadeen news outlet and camera operator Wissam Qasim from Hezbollah's Al-Mana were killed, according to the outlets. The strike marks the deadliest day for media personnel in the year-long hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel has not yet commented but has previously denied targeting journalists. Well, for more, I'm joined by retired General of the Lebanese Army, Khalil Helou. Sir, thanks for making time. And welcome. I'll start quite simply by asking you what the chances are you think that there will be any progress made towards a ceasefire while your caretaker Prime Minister is in London meeting with the Secretary of State from the US, Antony Blinken.
Okay. You want to discuss that immediately?
Go ahead. Is there something you'd rather start with?
Yes. Okay. Now, the London meeting is mainly designed or planned in order to support the Lebanese army. And this indicates that the current fight in South Lebanon is not only between Israel and Hezbollah, but it is a demarcation line between Iran and the free world. It's not anymore an issue that is related only to the current conflict between Hezbollah and Israel, because the 1701, the importance of the 1701, and the option and the only option to implement it is through the Lebanese army, and the importance that is given to the Lebanese army by countries who are meeting in London indicates that there is a great hope for that. It's not only for Lebanon, it's to appease the entire region. It is to raise or to push for stability or appeasement of this conflict in the entire region, because it's not an issue only regarding Lebanon. So the London meeting will, of course, there will be an assistance to the Lebanese army. There will be support, financial support, material support, and so on. Now, I have to stress on a point that the Lebanese army is well equipped, and the mission of the Lebanese army is not to fight in South Lebanon. It is to implement a council, the resolution of the Security Council, and the Hezbollah repeatedly said that they are okay they agree on the implementation. But the gap is that they didn't give details or a roadmap for that. So this is where the things should be stressed on Hezbollah and on the Lebanese government in order to give a clear roadmap. How shall we implement the 1701 that they agree for? So the London meeting is a necessity by itself. The Lebanese army already is assisted by the United States and by European countries and by Arab countries already. Now, in the London meeting, it will be asserted on that, and a guarantee that the financial aid and the material aid, equipment aid for the Lebanese army will be guaranteed, because you need a logistic line that is permanent. The capabilities of the Lebanese army are not to be proven, and the number of personnel that should be deployed in South Lebanon is much less important than the will to implement this resolution. In this resolution, it is mentioned that the Lebanese army should deploy 15,000 men. Well, if Hezbollah agrees seriously and not if they are not maneuvering, and if Israel agrees also, I think that the number of troops, even if it is 8,000 or 9,000, will be far enough. And currently, the Lebanese army has enough reserves to deploy there. But they should, of course, recruit some more troops in order to fulfill missions in other parts of the country. Because the mission in South Lebanon, you can't send there troops that are freshly recruited, but troops that are experienced, like the regiments that are available for the Army Command now and that are the reserve of the Army Command, could be easily deployed in South Lebanon and then replaced by freshly recruited personnel.
So you've raised a lot of different points there, but are you saying that the London meeting is essential to work out a way to basically ensure that the 1701 resolution is adhered to by all parties?
Yes.
Okay, yes. And at the same time, you're saying that the Lebanese army is doing everything it can, but that there needs to be some sort of will and negotiation power from Hezbollah as well in order for all this to de-escalate.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, this is what I'm saying, exactly. But I stressed on a point that Hezbollah, through the government, because Hezbollah is represented in the government by 2 ministers, and Hezbollah mandated President Nabih Berri, the Speaker of the House, to negotiate on its behalf. So all this is clear, but what is not clear is the roadmap. Because when you engage yourself, when the Hezbollah engages to implement the 1701, they should say what is the first step, the second, the third step, and what on the other side, what the Lebanese government asks from Israel to do. It's a step against another step, a step from Hezbollah and the Lebanese army and another step from Israel. So this is where the things are not clear. And this is where we didn't understand, at least the observers didn't understand what was the topics of the negotiations between Amos Hochstein and Mr. Nabih Berri, the Speaker of the House.
Interesting. So that's your theory on why things haven't progressed enough. I mean, in terms of what you know about Hezbollah from your experience, do you think there's a chance that you're going to see any kind of suggestions about the type of roadmap you need?
Well, no, Hezbollah will not capitulate. Hezbollah is 42 years old. Even though they received a serious blow on their structures, on their equipment, they lost hundreds of men. But if there is a ceasefire, they have the capability to reorganize and to rebuild capacities. This is why we are concerned by the fact that they are maneuvering in order to buy some time. And also, you cannot dissociate what's going on in South Lebanon and in London from what Israel is intending to do with Iran. If Israel strikes Iran, well, I expect that Iran will ask Hezbollah to use the maximum power that they have in order to retaliate over Israel, because Iran fired 520 missiles on Israel and there were no casualties. Whereas Hezbollah is firing much less powerful weapons on Israel and is inflicting casualties on Israel. So this indicates clearly that Iran is counting on Hezbollah for retaliation, at least partially, if Israel strikes Iran.
Indeed, that missile
we cannot dissociate. We cannot dissociate these issues one from the other.
What's happening in South Lebanon with Israel's relations with Iran and that missile barrage you're talking about that happened October 1st with those ballistic missiles being rained down on Israel, as you said, with no serious casualties. But there is an expected retaliation and has been promised for some time. And elsewhere we're speaking to people who are saying that could happen in the next fortnight or so. Are you worried that if Israel gets the balance wrong, if you like, if they strike too hard, we're going to end up in another escalation cycle?
Well, we expect that Israel will strike Iran very soon, before the U.S. elections, and I cannot foresee what are the alternatives, because there are a lot of talks about where Israel is going to strike, what Israel is going to strike. Iran is promising retaliations, especially today, the speech of Mr. Blinken that things in the Middle East are going worse. He didn't talk about South Lebanon. When we hear that Iran is preparing a retaliation and is mobilizing and so, well, I think that this will reflect on Lebanon for sure. And maybe the Israeli campaign now on Hezbollah, the intensification of this campaign now could be related to that, to degrade Hezbollah power to the maximum in order to decrease or to weaken the retaliation that Hezbollah could carry out if Iran is struck by Israel. This is what I can say about that.
Elsewhere, let's talk about other things that have happened in the last 24 hours, including this strike by Israel on a building that was known to house journalists and reporters in southeastern Lebanon. And 3 men who worked for broadcasters, some of which were Iranian-aligned, were killed. They were media kind of operators, camera operators as well. We spoke their names at the start of our discussion to you. How do you think Israel is going to explain that? Do you think it was deliberate?
Well, I think that the Israelis are not concerned about explaining it. They already killed a lot of journalists in Lebanon and in Gaza, and what they did is a crime. It's unacceptable by all means, because they know very well that these houses or this complex of houses in Hasbaya is harboring journalists of diverse chains, and they targeted the place where the journalist of Al-Manar, that is relevant of Hezbollah, and of Al-Mayadeen, that is obedient to Iran. They targeted this house specifically, this apartment specifically. Now, even though I have opposite opinions regarding the opinions of these journalists, but killing journalists is to be condemned. So what Israel is going to do now, Israel is continuing the campaign on South Lebanon, the land campaign. They are already present in about 150 square kilometers in South Lebanon, but they are not holding the ground as a classical invasion or a classical occupation. They are carrying out what we call kinetic operations. So they are always moving. They don't have fixed positions. And this is understandable because Hezbollah is a guerrilla. The positions of Hezbollah are concealed. They are not visible. They are not apparent. So any position that the Israelis could occupy on the land and as a fixed position will be a very easy target for Hezbollah. So this is why the operations in South Lebanon are kinetic. Already there is a dozen of villages that are empty of their inhabitants. The Israeli army apparently has a liberty of movement inside these villages, and they are within a narrow buffer zone between the border and the inside Lebanon. The depth of this let's say buffer zone varies from several hundred meters to 4 kilometers. But as I told you, globally it is around 250 square kilometers of land. The border with Israel is 70 kilometers. It is almost invaded, as I told you, with a narrow buffer zone. But also the borders between Lebanon and occupied Golan in Syria, 60 kilometers. Also, we have Israeli incursions in part of it. And I think that they will continue their operations in order to let's say, to achieve a continuous occupied zone from Nakura in the west, to the Golan in the east. This is what they intend to do, and this is what is unfolding on the ground. And maybe from this buffer zone, they could carry out kinetic operations deep inside Lebanon in order to press Hezbollah to withdraw from south of the Litani River. And meanwhile, they continue to target the major positions of Hezbollah deep in Lebanon, in the Bekaa Valley and in Beirut.
Retired General of the Lebanese Army, Khalil Khalou, thank you. To the war on Gaza now, and Israel has announced it will send negotiators to Qatar this weekend to discuss a potential Gaza deal amid rising casualties from its military operations in northern Gaza recently. Officials say head of Israel's Mossad, David Barnea, will join US and Qatari officials in Doha. Qatar confirming that Israeli and US teams will travel to Doha, with Qatari mediators re-engaging with Hamas following the death of its leader Yahya Sinwar. The meeting comes after US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said new options for a ceasefire and hostage release are being explored after previous negotiations stalled. For more on this, I'm joined by former intelligence officer in the Israeli Defense Force and former special advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel, working with Ehud Barak on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, Yossi Alfa. Thank you for making time for us to discuss this. And I mean, it seems to have taken a while to get back into serious negotiation processes for a ceasefire in Gaza. Do you think we're going to see progress this time around?
Well, we're going to see another meeting on Sunday in Doha for the first time in, I think, a couple of months, actually. That's certainly encouraging for all of us who want to see our hostages freed, which for many of us is the highest priority of this war. But frankly, I'm not terribly optimistic that we're going to see a breakthrough anytime in the next 2 weeks.
Why is that? Why aren't you optimistic for a breakthrough in the next 2 weeks?
I would point to two very important variables that have nothing to do with Doha, that are critical here. One is the American elections on November 5th, and the other is a prospect of some sort of Israeli revenge attack on Iran, which we are generally assured is coming sometime in the coming days. Now, in both respects, we're seeing a great deal of activity by American diplomacy. Blinken was just here. An American representative was in Lebanon. I don't know, he may still be there. The Americans are quite obviously very anxious, that is the Biden administration, very anxious to keep the lid on here for the next 2 weeks, to see peace and quiet, nothing that would overly disturb the elections. At the same time, they understand that there's going to be some Israeli attack on Iran. And the dynamic of these two developments, along with the war itself on 2 fronts or on 7 fronts, depending how you count, and the prospect of talking in Doha, to my mind, means it's not very likely we're going to see a breakthrough soon, because the American emphasis is just on maintaining a modicum of peace and quiet for the next 10 days.
That's an interesting take I hadn't considered previously, but it does seem to make sense in terms of politically in the US. Why? I mean, obviously, if everyone could find a breakthrough in the next 2 weeks, they would, but you're saying it's just not going to come quickly enough for that transition of government in the US. And when we do see a transition, whether it be Democrat, Republican, are you saying that's going to tie things up as well?
Well, look, a hostage deal next week would be good for the Biden administration and for Harris's electoral chances. On the other hand, an Israeli attack in Iran could conceivably breed an escalatory spiral that would be seen as detrimental to the administration and to Harris's electoral chances, because the American public would see that the U.S. can't maintain, it can't look after its interests, if you like, in the Middle East. So there are different directions here. And of course, we haven't yet factored in unexpected developments in the Gaza Strip or in Lebanon, which could also have an effect. There's new information on greater Russian aid and participation on the Iranian side in what could turn out to be another Israeli-Iranian battle. All of this can have an effect on the world, on the United States, and Israel then is particularly sensitive to American pressures in this regard, because it has become so reliant on American military aid in prosecuting this war.
Yeah, that's what I'm interested to ask you more on, Israel being so in hock to the US, that if the US, it's in the US's interest to keep this in a sort of restrained holding pattern for the time being, failing a big breakthrough, and of course the release of the hostages, because the release of the hostages wouldn't just be good for the Biden administration, it'd be good for the hostages and the Israeli families waiting for them back home, of course, but also surely for Netanyahu's government as well. But is it so much tied up in the US that Netanyahu's having to kind of go along with what Blinken's suggesting?
Well, that's an interesting comment you made on the Netanyahu government's interest in a hostage deal, because the Netanyahu government is the most right-wing government we've ever had. There are in it elements, messianic elements, who will oppose any price Israel is asked to pay in releasing Hamas prisoners in return for the release of hostages, and will try to veto any deal that is achieved in Doha, or for that matter in Cairo, wherever it is achieved. So a deal once agreed between the parties is not necessarily a done deal. On the other hand, the Biden administration is currently in a position where, at least until the elections, it's very hard put to say no to Netanyahu, whether it's on arms or on the price being paid for hostages or whatever. But after November 5th, whether it's a lame duck administration or the beginning of a Harris administration, I would wager that Biden will take a very different approach. He doesn't have a lot of patience for Mr. Netanyahu and his government for fairly understandable reasons. And we might see quite a reversal then. So again, back to this November 5th deadline, which is not just for American elections, but for developments in the Middle East as well.
Let's talk about who is actually going to this mediation in Doha, because supposedly the head of Israel's Mossad spy agency, David Barnea, going. Given your previous experience in intelligence, can you give us, our viewers, an idea of what kind of role he would play?
Well, Barnea, this is his file, and it has been since the beginning. There's someone parallel, General Alon, in the IDF, who also holds the file in the IDF. They will both be going, and it's generally understood that they are ready to be more forthcoming in terms of Israeli concessions, what Israel pays for hostage release, more forthcoming than the Netanyahu government, and certainly than the extremist elements in that government. So there's a tension here, and obviously Barnea has a mandate, but not an unlimited mandate. Whatever agreements he reaches, if he reaches, will have to be brought back to Netanyahu and the cabinet.
So that's what you were describing before, that even if something is agreed around that negotiating table, and you're saying it probably won't be anyway, but in Doha, that it might not necessarily be taken up by Netanyahu's government.
Yeah, but let's see. I mean, obviously, if Barnea reaches an agreement and can bring it back to Jerusalem, this will be a step in the right direction. And again, given the international circumstances, the pressures that in Israel, I would say this would improve the chances of an agreement. But I go back to my opening remark. I don't think an agreement is likely in the coming days. I think it's good that we're renewing negotiations. That's a step in the right direction. This is not something that can be wrapped up in a couple of days of talks.
And talking of the people that will be there, currently unconfirmed that anybody from Hamas is going to participate in the Doha meeting. Can you explain to us why that would be?
No, Hamas does not agree to sit down with Israel at the table, nor does Hezbollah for that matter. We're talking about a militant Islamists who don't recognize Israel, whose credo is to destroy Israel, and they refuse to sit at the table with it. So there's no danger they're going to be in the room. They'll be in another room, presumably. But again, this is the external Hamas, or what's left of it, and not the Gaza internal Hamas, or what's left of this. And this points to the fact that Hamas is in a genuine leadership crisis. And this may be a very important negative factor in Hamas's ability to reach any agreement or to even desire an agreement. There's a new leadership after Sinwar, and we really don't know if that leadership, if circumstances are such that that leadership is going to be a bit more moderate or more extreme.
Well, given your experience of analysing organisations like Hamas and Hamas itself, do you think it would be more moderate or more extreme at this point?
I'm sorry, given my experience as an intelligence analyst, what I can do is the right thing in these circumstances, which is to ask the right question. Will it be more moderate or more extreme? Ask Mr. Barnea when he comes back from Doha. He will have a far better idea.
Fine. No, we can try and approach Mr. Barnea and ask that question. I appreciate that you can't speculate on that. Look, let's talk about Secretary of State, well, current anyway, for the time being a bit longer, Antony Blinken. When he was in Doha, his words were, the US and Qatar are seeking a plan so that Israel can withdraw, so that Hamas cannot reconstitute, and so that Palestinian people can rebuild their lives and rebuild their futures. Do you think there's enough will currently in Israel and among the Israeli government for all of that to happen?
No. No. This is this government is against, and we go back before the war, before October 7th, 23. This government is against dialoguing with the Palestinians on any kind of political settlement, not with Hamas, which, as I said, refuses to dialogue with Israel anyway, but with the PLO. And so with refusalists on both sides, Hamas and the Netanyahu government, talk of starting a political process looking toward the renewal of a dialogue about a two-state solution, I think is fanciful in the present circumstances.
Interesting. Look, while we've got you, there's also, as you said, there's a multi-front conflict going on with Lebanon as well. Blinken in London today. He's meeting Lebanon's caretaker Prime Minister. They obviously want to discuss more the idea of a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. There are signs from certain reports I've read from certain Israeli military officials that seem to indicate that could be on the cards and could be tied up sooner than people might have pessimistically thought. Do you reckon that's the case?
Well, I think we have a better chance of reaching some new modus vivendi with Hezbollah than with Hamas. And here, bear in mind that Amos Hochstein, the American emissary, has been talking to Hezbollah, again, indirectly to Hezbollah, but nevertheless talking to them from before the war, has actually managed to mediate a maritime agreement between Israel and the Lebanese government, which Hezbollah acquiesced in. Hezbollah has been badly bruised and battered in recent weeks, lost its leadership. Israel is basically prepared to see enforced the UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which goes back about a decade, no, even further, but after the Second Lebanon War, 2006. So there's a UN basis for discussions of some new outcome in Lebanon. The Lebanese, with the exception of Hezbollah, the Lebanese are anxious to see this happen. If it weren't for Hezbollah, Lebanon and Israel could reach an agreement, I think, fairly easily. So if there's going to be a breakthrough on some front in this war, it's going to be on the Lebanon front and not on the Gaza front, at least in the weeks ahead.
And returning to one of your earlier points about the still promised retaliatory attack by Israel on Iran, this is in response to the 1st of October missile barrage that we saw, ballistic missiles being fired from Iran over into Israel. And I mean, it's still on the cards. It's still said, you know, it will happen, but there's no sign of it yet. And obviously, we're not going to ask you to speculate on when or what it could be. But you think it's still definitely, there's still something coming?
Look, nothing is definite in this war. I suppose one could speculate that it's conceivable that in return for certain considerations from the Biden administration, Netanyahu would agree to postpone this kind of Israeli action until after the U.S. elections, and that in the meantime, if there's progress with Hezbollah, which is in our eyes the long arm of Iran, it's a direct proxy of Iran. Hezbollah is Iran. If there's progress with Hezbollah, that could be another reason to continue to postpone. And of course, the longer you postpone an act of retribution, the less it looks like retribution, and the less likely it is to take place. So that's a scenario that would explain the lack of an Israeli attack on Iran. If I had to give odds, I would say it's more likely that we are going to see an Israeli attack on Iran in the coming days. You'll have no early warning of it. It will come as a surprise because there's a strong feeling in Israeli security circles that Iran has to get a deterrent message from Israel that it cannot get away with attacking us. And by the way, you're talking to someone who went through that October 1 attack with the worst booms I've heard in this entire war directly over my head. I fully understand the desire for a revenge attack and for a deterrent attack, which will send a message to the Iranians not to do it again. On the other hand, if we overdo it, Iran will feel it has to respond and deter, and we get an escalatory spiral. So part of the difficulty here, one part of the difficulty here is the leak from the Pentagon, which conceivably actually revealed some Israeli plans and forces Israel to rethink its operational plans. But the other is the desire to fine-tune it so that you send a non-escalatory deterrent message that puts an end to this spiral or tit-for-tat between Israel and Iran, at least for the time being. That requires a lot of fine-tuning. So, you know, as we discuss this, we see how many different dimensions there are. It's not just between Israel and Iran. It involves the Biden administration, it involves Lebanon, it involves domestic Israeli considerations, and fine-tuning leaks. And the outcome, we'll have to wait and see. I think all bets are off as far as giving odds as to if this takes place and when it takes place.
Interesting stuff. Look, former intelligence officer in the Israeli Defense Force and former special advisor to the Prime Minister of Israel, Yossi Alfa. Thank you.
Thank you.
That is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you for watching, and be sure to join us on Monday for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
They've got to have a vote and a say.
it's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on The Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
Amsterdam. Trust us, there are many reasons to see Amsterdam other than the things the city is notoriously known for. A few walks into Amsterdam and you'll certainly fall in love with it. The Dutch city is unique and amazing, and there's definitely so much to do. First, you can just enjoy the weather, take in the magnificent views, and ride a bike around the city. You can easily rent one. There are so many bikes, hundreds and thousands on the streets. It's definitely a great way to see the city, enjoy the scenery, and mingle with the locals. You must also visit the Dam Square for a dose of the city's history. You can check out the Royal Palace, the Nieuwe Kerk, or New Church, and the National Monument. Aside from seeing the sights, you can also shop or try the local delicacies. One of Amsterdam's specialties are its waffles. These sweet treats are excessively popular. Their famous Stroop waffle is made from 2 thin layers of grilled waffles stuck together with syrup. You can eat it however you like, with more sweets or fruits, such as strawberries. You'll also love Amsterdam for its local beer. It's a must for those who love beer. After all, the city is considered home of Heineken International Headquarters. Not much of a beer drinker? No problem, as there are many cafes you'll surely stroll by. What's best about these cafes are their seats that face the streets, the perfect way to people watch. Aside from that, there's also the Fashion and Museum District. Notable museums are the Rich Museum, the Van Gogh Museum, and the Stedelijk. Definitely not to be missed. The city is also a place to shop high-end luxury brands. Amsterdam is also known for its great shopping malls, housed in historic buildings, such as an old post office. The buildings are of great design and are luxurious sights to see. Inside it are the top-tiered brands for both men and women, beauty finds, and more. Indeed, the city's got everything you'll need.
The inks and medads have placed us in a trance, as we were dazzled by their diversity and enchanting colors. They decorated our Arab manuscripts and substantiated them. The Arabs did not stop at what we know of inks, as their innovation reached a level that was unheard of, that was known as invisible inks. The Arabs succeeded in learning the secrets of inks, and especially invisible inks. They were colorless liquids that, when used on a normal piece of paper, would be unseeable by the reader's eye until after it was exposed to certain changes, which could be heating it up or exposing it to the fumes of certain substances. These inks were used frequently during highly confidential correspondences. The idea behind it was to use materials that created solutions that were colorless. The ability of Arabs to produce invisible ink was based on taking white zaj, also known as vitriol, and writing with it. Glue would then be wiped onto it to reveal the writing. Another process would be done in a reversed manner, where the person would write with the glue, and the white vitriol would then be applied to the writing. The writing would appear in a different form. There are many ways to produce invisible ink. Despite the development of tools and inks that Arabs used to produce their manuscripts, that did not prevent them from striving for even greater excellence when making their manuscripts. This distinction came through the use of gold and silver in the making of some types of materials that were used to write on special paper. Golden ink was often used when writing the names of the surahs of the Holy Quran, along with their numbers and the number of their verses. It was also used in the titles of important manuscripts of high artistic value. Some masahif were written in pure gold ink. The ink was prepared by grinding gold leaf flakes with Arabic gum, or pure honey. After writing with it and having it dry out, gloss must be added to it for it to shine. There was another method of writing, where the drying or writing would be done with a mixture of glue with plant sugar, and before it would dry, a very thin layer of gold or silver is placed on the surface of the writing that would adhere to it. The Arabs reached the pinnacle of writing and mastered its secrets. They knew various ways of having it set in, and at the same time knew ways to erase the writing. So, they made what is commonly known today as the eraser. Boiled Yemeni alum, asaf alum, which is hay, and yellow sulfur were gathered. These materials are ground together until they become fine in texture, and they were soaked in vinegar and crushed until the mixture became similar in texture to an ointment. It is then cut into small pieces that are the size of an acorn, and rubbing these pieces against any writing would lead to it being removed. These inks and tools, in their various types and components, formed an important part of the process of producing Arab manuscripts. Because of the Arabs' keen interest in their inks, they excelled in creating their inkwells, giving them as much attention as they would offer their ink and materials, as it was a writing tool and a means of producing manuscripts. The inkwell is but a cog in the larger mechanism that involves various components, that being the pen case or the dawa. It is the mother of writing instruments, and it includes all that is needed by writers and all of what would help them complete their manuscripts. The Arabs were keen on maintaining the quality of their pen cases. They made them from the finest and most expensive of woods. They used ebony, cedar wood, and sandalwood. They would then insert brass and steel into the construction of it to protect it from breaking. The best type of pen cases were of medium size and would be the length of an arm to fit their pens and to ensure ease of carrying. Early writers took great care of their writing tools and instruments. They chose their dawa and pens expertly and tastefully. They would boast about the elegance of their pen cases and the fluidity of their pen, as well as the type of paper and ink they used. The writing mechanism and paper would vary according to the status of the writer and the courtly duties they may have. The dawa and pens of the teacher would differ from those used by the caliphates and ministers. The paper used in official letters would also be different from those used in financial records. The dawa was described as the treasury of literature. It was carefully crafted and decorated with inscriptions and pictures. Muhammad bin Yahya as-Suli, who passed away in the year 335 Hijri, stated, "The pen case must be medium in size, moderate in its value, not gentle so as its pens may be shortened by it, nor too large so that it would be a burden to carry." Writers of the 8th century Hijri and beyond, according to Al-Kalkashandi, stopped using wooden pen cases and began to use copper and steel instead. Copper was more commonly used. It was part of writing etiquette for the writers to keep their dawa clean and would treat it with salt and camphor every 2 to 3 days. Arab and Islamic museums are remarkably free of any of these cases, despite weapons such as swords and shields, traces of money, and pulpits being preserved. Despite the stir caused by the world of writing, with its tools and equipment, and despite its tradition and the industry behind its workshops, there are no traces of that world remaining, except in the letters left behind those who contributed to it, and the sentences of those who progressed it with details, material, and advice for authors. As Al-Madaini said, "Gather your equipment and work hard to preserve them, as dawas are the treasuries of literature."
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to